The Beatles invented grunge.
Before things really took off, I think Soundgarden were really one of the bands that were laying the groundwork.
I think for Soundgarden, the Melvins were kind of a big inspiration for us when they sort of changed gears and slowed everything down.
The success of the U-Men early on, the sort of free, independent, creative decision-making of Malfunction and Melvins.
I guess if I had to pick one, I'd say the Melvins.
I think the Melvins were pretty crucial.
Green River, you could call proto-grunge, or really the true originators.
A lot of people say that it was Green River, but I actually spoke with Stone Gossard, who was in Green River, and he said it was 100% Mudhoney.
To ask who invented grunge is about the same as asking who invented heavy metal. There were so many different bands involved in the creation of this type of angsty rock and roll that it's really hard to name just one. This year marks 30 years since some of the absolute biggest masterpieces in rock history came out. So we're going to spend a couple weeks examining how this little scene that started in Seattle ended up taking over the world. But first, we're going to go back to the beginning and take a closer look at the early contenders who helped lay the foundation for it.
I think it was really an amalgamation, but the Melvins, absolutely, you could say that sounds so grungy.
And how does Buzz Osborne feel about the Melvins' association to Seattle and grunge?
I've been in California since 86, 87, Los Angeles since 93. Yet we're still lumped in with all of the Seattle stuff, which I think is kind of funny. We were a completely different thing outside of all of that, yet still we're kind of pushed into all of it as well, which I thought was kind of ironic. But
I can understand why he feels that way. If I take a few steps back and observe and listen to these bands that have been lumped together over the years, I can understand why any number of them don't understand why they get lumped together. But the facts are what they are, and his band was incredibly influential.
But the Melvins were doing this other thing. They were really fast. They were the fastest band in the area, and they became the slowest band in the area overnight.
Those bands saw something in us because they came out of punk rock as well.
Despite their move away from the scene, Melvins were later cited by several of the Seattle bands as an inspiration, primarily because of the way they blended different styles of rock and heavy music together into a new sound of its own.
I think that it is a moment in time where there was a crossroads of genres. So it was when punk was meeting heavy metal, which was meeting classic rock. And it was this groundbreaking time where punk had to evolve, punk had to change. And there were these bands that were all happening at the same time in Seattle, whether it was the Melvins, The Living, it was 10 Minute Warning.
The Melvins taking a lot of the punk rock of the time, and they were the first band to really slow it down and make it heavy.
I heard a sound in my head that was different than what I'd heard before. A lot of it was at a slower pace, but I wanted to do it in a little different, more of a metal kind of way, sort of. Although I didn't want all the trappings of heavy metal either. I wanted kind of a hybrid of the whole thing. My musical instincts were correct at the time, even though it took a long time for people to kind of pick up on that.
While Motley Crue and other Aquanet-infused Los Angeles bands were beginning to dominate the rock charts, Melvins and their contemporaries were combining influences from Led Zeppelin to Black Flag and setting the precedent for this punk rock metal fusion that would eventually take over. Other groups that were making a similar sound?
The U-Men from Seattle, they were probably my favorite band. I liked Malfunction a great deal. They were always really funny, good players.
Malfunction was unabashed about their interests, and he's got long blonde hair and he's wearing makeup and he's playing bass, but it's super heavy and distorted, but he's singing with this kind of comical, effeminate, tone and strutting around stage. And they may have been the band that said, these guys are, said to everybody else, these guys are having fun. They're not about the rules. They're making their own rules.
Grunt Truck is a band that is near and dear to my heart. There were a lot of bands I don't know if you could say that they got lost in the shuffle, but at a certain point, there were so many artists.
I was really aware of this band called the Wipers from Portland. I thought they had this amazing melodic sense, but they were really garagey and rough sounding, and they just incorporated everything I loved about the music scene up here.
And Screaming Trees were around as an indie band early on as well, and their style had changed a bit, but Screaming Trees were another example of what was happening.
There's another band I should mention, Bam Bam, that I played with very briefly, that were one of the original kind of grunge bands, rock bands, with an amazing singer, Tina Bell, who always deserves credit.
Continually, it is really, really hard in the rock arena for female artists to get their due respect for their contribution to the music scene, and Seattle is no exception. From Karaoke, from Hammerbox and Goodness, The Gits, Mia Zapata, and Hole.
There was never a point where we went, hey, this is grunge. Other people did that. But it was a bunch of communities that basically assembled as one community. It was the Northwest music scene.
It wasn't one band. It was a community of one band after another, this amazing pool of talent. And band members were moving from band to band, and you could start recognizing certain guitarists and certain vocalists.
Even though there are different styles, they all kind of came together to create this, scene.
There was a sound, and it wasn't a band. It was just the sound of all those bands were making. It had a certain color that was very Seattle. And for a good half of the year or more, the primary color here is gray.
Now that you've heard a couple of the names that were part of the scene, let's talk about why Green River were so important. Mark Arm formed Green River in 1984 with Steve Turner, Alex Vincent, and two names that might really ring a bell, Jeff Ammon and Stone Gossard. Named after Washington's infamous serial killer, the Green River Killer, the band made a name for themselves by playing high-energy shows that often consisted of Arm rolling around on stage or jumping off.
Green River kind of sprung up from a long-standing friendship between Mark Arm and Bruce. They were a killer band. I admit the first few times that I saw them, they didn't blow me away as much as this record release show that they performed for Dry as a Bone, which was the first EP that Sub Pop put out. That show is, to this day, blows my mind thinking about it. It's just one of those perfect shows.
Green River and Mudhoney, I think part of that is one person, that's Mark Arm. He was very, very influential just as a scenester, just really kind of gelling the whole thing and bringing people together. With Green River especially, he kind of started some of the early stage antics of, jumping off the stage, and people elsewhere that didn't know anything about the scene per se would see these photographs and then be like, oh wow, I want to be a part of that. Or
they released an EP on Sub Pop, and the label was elated to have their own household band, until later that year when they broke up because they couldn't see eye to eye anymore. Fortunately, Arm formed Mudhoney the following year, and the single Touch Me I'm Sick off the EP Super Fuzz Big Muff was a big success for Sub Pop, and the distorted nature of the track and the chaotic energy of their live show would have a huge influence on what was to come from other bands in the area.
Even Mudhoney doesn't get talked about as much as they should in relationship to, where the scene went and how big, because they were really the originators of the whole term grunge. Their first single had a picture of Bruce Pavitt's toilet on the cover, so Touch Me I'm Sick, that I took.
But I think although Mudhoney was of course a pioneer of grunge, if you go back and listen to all those bands, you can hear in every single one of them sort of the blueprints for what would become grunge.
Another band that came out of the dissolution of Green River was Mother Love Bone. Jeff Ammon and Stone Gossard teamed up with singer Andrew Wood, who was known as Landrew of the Eccentric Malfunction. But they came a few years after the next band we're going to focus on, so we'll come back to them a little later. So by now, we know that the pioneers of the Seattle grunge scene were playing punk-infused, metal-inspired, raucous rock and roll. But while a lot of these groups wouldn't go on to see the enormous commercial success later associated with grunge, a few, which were inspired by the aforementioned groups, did.
I was playing with a trio at the time called Feedback. We were playing at a pizza parlor. The band that was going to play after us was a band called the Shimps, and that had Chris, Hero, and Kim.
Hero quit. I started playing bass and all these moving parts, and eventually I'm playing live shows around with a couple friends of mine, and Chris is singing, and everybody wanted to do something else. Except for the guy who started that band. Everyone wanted to write music and start something that's more original, more inventive, more creative. And we eventually did that. Chris moved in with Hero. They started jamming together. They started looking for guitars to play with. They got their rhythm section really strong. They weren't meeting a lot of people who were of their caliber and ability that also had their interests. So they talked me into coming by and jamming, and it immediately connected. We were so happy and enthused by the first two jams that we had. Nothing had been so easy, creatively and natural.
One thing I do remember about that first time seeing those guys play was hearing Chris sing. His voice completely filled the room. He had an amazing stage presence, but we were all kids at that time. So when I was playing my set with Feedback, Chris was watching me. Like, he was just like totally eyeballing the drummer. And eventually I was neighbors with Kim, and I would go see Soundgarden play before I joined, like in 85. And I always thought they were just the best band in Seattle.
Ben McMillan, he tipped me off to this band. The guitar player's name was Kay Clone. That was Kim Thiel. When I first saw him, not knowing that he was, a guitar god, and I just thought he was another fucked up college student who worked at KCMU, I was like, really? And then I saw him on stage at the Rainbow, and I was like, and the singer was playing the drums. And I said, oh, this is all kinds of no good. But they blew my mind. Halfway through the show, Chris came up from behind the drums, started being Chris Cornell, that we all recognized.
The first time I saw Soundgarden, they were a three-piece, and Chris was singing and playing drums. But I thought, wow, that drummer should just be singing, and they should get a drummer.
And he's drumming with us and singing. It's kind of tough because the way we're writing things in odd time signatures. He would offer to either focus on singing or focus on drumming. And what did we think? He said he was leaning toward wanting to sing, which makes sense. We said, well, I don't know. You're a really good drummer. We like the way we write with you. That was the initial magic, was Hero on bass, Chris on drums, me on guitar. So we're writing, we're prolific. This is so natural and easy. If you go to sing, we're going to lose this. He's very musically talented, and his insight was to understand how his lyric writing and vocal melody and dynamic would fit within the context of what the three of us were doing.
I remember him not speaking to the crowd for like a good year or two, like when I first joined. The way that he would perform back then is he sort of went into this trance. When I would watch those guys before I joined, I was just really mesmerized by the way Chris would just sort of like turn into this shaman kind of dude, Eventually he became more comfortable with an audience. And I just think he was naturally a really shy person, believe it or not.
But the thing that was so amazing is that he was kind of a gawky, awkward guy who was totally possessed. And this voice comes out of him. It was like Linda Blair in The Exorcist. And I walked up to the stage, the front of the stage. I introduced myself and pretty well committed myself to putting out a Soundgarden record. I didn't really know how to.
I had done a lot of concert promoting. So I met a lot of musicians that way, one of which was Soundgarden. Soundgarden had a very melodic, hypnotic sound. They were at a point where they had made a demo tape, a cassette tape. That was in late 85, early 86. Through that, Chris and I started a relationship, and there also was the beginning of a more coalesced Sub Pop Records. Sub Pop had existed for a long time. It was an underground tape series that Bruce Pavitt had curated for years.
It's Bruce Pavitt who had Sub Pop magazine. He was writing and reviewing local bands, and he was drawing attention to bands that he liked. He was drawing attention to what he saw as he was drawing attention to the scene that he thought had a unique and distinct identity apart from what was going on in the rest of the country.
I had heard Bruce's name around for a while. I was a fan of his writing. We just started to see each other more and more at the same shows, and I had an idea of doing a record label, and he had already had one.
It started to become more formal, and they were ready to put some records out, so Soundgarden became one of their first records.
Soundgarden released their debut single Hunted Down through Sub Pop in 1987, followed by the Screaming Life EP later that year, and FOP in 1988.
So with Soundgarden, I was just helping get the word out and make contacts for them. So it was really kind of by default. Chris and I had been seeing each other for some time at that point, and the more their profile grew, the more help they needed. So I just by default kept helping them. I didn't really have any intention of managing them because it just smacked of Spinal Tap, and that it wasn't a look I was going for. But eventually it all worked out.
Soundgarden eventually moved on from Sub Pop and signed to SST Records in 1988, and through the label, they put out their debut album, Ultra Mega OK.
This is about 88 now, and around that time I got introduced to Alice in Chains.
The beginnings of Alice in Chains date back to the mid-'80s when Lane Staley and Jerry Cantrell met at a party in Seattle. The guitarist needed somewhere to live, so Staley invited him to room with him at the Music Bank, which was a rehearsal studio with a bunch of different rooms. Cantrell eventually began jamming with Sean Kinney and Mike Starr, and asked Staley to sing for them after seeing him perform with his band, Alice in Chains. Staley initially refused Cantrell's offer because he already had his own gig, but that fell apart soon after, so he accepted. They initially went under the moniker Diamond Lie. After a bit of time had passed, Staley phoned his former bandmate and asked for permission to take the name Alice in Chains for his new band.
The Alice guys were hijinks hilarity, and they sort of lived the rock star lifestyle, even though they all lived in one of the guys' mom's rental house. It was more like the Monkees than a big rock star band. With Alice, I was already managing the other groups and Soundgarden, and my office mate was managing them. The guys and my office mate needed some help, and so my office mate suggested that, or Kelly, who was our other office mate, and I work with Alice. So the first time I met them, picked us up in a limousine with the band, going to their second show. They spent the entire drive to the venue out in the suburbs reciting every line from Fletch in unison. And it was so fun and so funny, and everything about them on stage was so filled with life and energy and irreverence that I knew it was special from the first time I saw them and first time I heard their also cassette tape.
Next, we have to talk about another little band that formed outside of Seattle in a town called Aberdeen. I shouldn't even have to say who it is, but yes, it's Nirvana, a trio that would go on to become one of the most influential bands in rock and roll history.
I used to call Jack Endino. He mentioned this band that had come in with Dale Crover, the drummer for the Melvins. When he heard them, it was unlike anything he could readily describe. And listening to that first demo tape, I completely agreed. It blew my mind. It was like so much more fully formed and Kurt's voice was so commanding and so soulful. And the first thing I did, after listening to it about 30 times in a row, is I went down to Muzak, where Bruce was working at the time. I was like feeding it to them, and I was like waiting. And the day passes, and a few days pass, and I finally call up Bruce, and I said, "So what do they think?"
Bruce Pavitt wasn't immediately impressed with their sound, but he offered to go see them play the next time they came to Seattle. By this point, they had recruited Chad Channing on the drums, and Pavitt heard their potential through their cover of Shocking Blues' Love Buzz.
It was when Bruce saw them play Love Buzz that he said, "Let's do a single with that band." And that was the first single that we did with the Sub Pop Singles Club.
Kurt knew who I was before I knew who they were, just because they were coming up from Aberdeen a little bit later than, Mudhoney and Soundgarden, et cetera, were already fairly well established, at least in the local scene here. And Kurt was definitely shy and somewhat introverted.
All right, now back to Mother Love Bone, which, as I said before, consisted of Andrew Wood, Jeff Ament, Stone Gossard, and 2 other musicians named Bruce Fairweather and Greg Gilmore, who had previously played in punk bands 10 Minute Warning and The Living with Duff McKagan. Gilmore ventured down to Los Angeles with McKagan in the mid-'80s. His comrade, of course, went on to join a couple of other LA musicians in a band called Guns N' Roses, but Gilmore decided to return to Seattle, where he became acquainted with Stone Gossard.
I went on a backpacker traveling trip to Southeast Asia for a few months. And then when I came back from that, I ran into Stone. We were acquainted but didn't really know each other. He invited me to come down and play, and I did, and that was it. That was the Mother Love Bone then that we all know today. That would have been probably January again of '88.
Andrew Wood and Mother Love Bone could play for 2 people at a local tavern, but the performance was as if they were playing in front of, at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles with Van Halen as a co-headliner.
Andy was a rock star. The story goes from his family. At 3 years old, he knew that's what he wanted to do.
This collection of young bands all started playing shows in Seattle and other cities nearby, such as Tacoma, Olympia, and Portland. Though a lot of us like to think of grunge as being a sort of overnight sensation, the development of the scene was a slow build. The majority of the crowds at the shows were made up of other musicians who were just there to support their friends.
When it first started out, the scene in Seattle got flummoxed pretty quickly by a teen dance ordinance, which made it to where all-age shows were pretty much impossible to do unless you were going to do it on a massive arena-like level. So we were immediately on an 18 and over no matter what.
There was a smattering of clubs. It took until the late 80s, early 90s for most of the bands to be able to go in them because of the 21 and over law in Washington State. You would find most nights the audience was made up primarily of people from other bands. That was the scene. It was a very, very healthy, robust scene of creative people.
There's definitely a collective aspect to the scene, and there's definitely a collaborative nature to our scene. Our understanding was there were some pockets of support in other music scenes, in other metropolitan areas, but there seemed to be a lot of infighting and competition in Chicago, New York, and there are always these little factions, of how things should be approached. And there may have been some of that with us, but in Seattle, but it was such a small scene. It was so insular. People were sharing records with each other and going to the same shows. People didn't really make the trek out to Seattle, so we'd go see each other's bands.
And so many of these local bands would either rehearse in these massive, rehearsal banks, like Music Bank, where every band had a room and would rehearse, or they'd band together and rent a stage at old theater that was converted to a live music venue, or a VFW hall, or a student union building at the University of Washington. And so multiple bands would get in the habit of working together. A guitarist wasn't available to play that night, another band's guitarist would sit in, and that was the solidification of the Seattle music family, where we're all intertwined, and There is no one that was competitive over the other.
There was a place that I used to book. I got a lot of the bands that would later become the sub pop bands and the happening Seattle bands. Their first tavern shows, they were all very small rooms.
There really wasn't much of an audience then. Bands like us and Green River and Soundgarden could advertise for 3 months for shows that you wouldn't get 50 people at.
At that time in the Pacific Northwest, there was not that many places to play. They all kind of had a pretty similar appreciation and enthusiasm for this type of rock music that a lot of bands were doing at that time.
People used to be able to go and like buy a ticket to go to many different clubs in Seattle in one night and go see a bunch of different bands. And all those bands would just support each other. I mean, because it was their scene, it was very insular in that sense. They had to support each other because, I mean, literally, you know, they were not really accepted. Some of the records, of course, got out by those bands and got playing college radio.
Well, when the bands first started playing, I mean, the scene was so small. You know, you would be lucky to get 50 to 100 of your friends out to a gig. So there was no real competition. It was very much supportive of each other.
Pretty cooperative. I don't remember now really having any sense of competition. The stakes were not high enough. You know, it wasn't big enough for that. It was just it just wasn't part of what we were all doing together. You know, it kind of felt like that's a key word, maybe. Everybody was in it together, sort of.
So we have the beginnings of a music scene in Seattle. Now, where the did the word grunge come from?
Bruce had noted in describing Dry as a Bone by Green River that it was ultra-loose grunge that destroyed the morals of a generation. But there was never a calculation that we had decided that this music is grunge.
Little did Pavitt know that the copy that he wrote for that Green River promo would go on to become a major term in popular culture to categorize this style of music. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not these particular artists rejected the term. So let's ask them how they felt about it.
But grunge as a term, nobody liked that. Everyone thought, oh, this is a marketing thing. This is a way to file Seattle on a retail display in a record store. We thought that's it. But initially we just rejected the term like grunge. But eventually we all just came to embrace it. It was just an easy reference, especially if you're talking to your parents. What kind of music do you do? Grunge. Oh, like Pearl Jam or Nirvana? Yeah, like that.
Oh, the term. I personally don't mind the term. If they like equate that term with, you know, with my bands and a music scene that I'm really proud to be a part of, then so be it, man. I know a lot of guys were sensitive to it when it first came out there. I guess that there was a need for a label from the industry, from the press. There was new wave, there was punk, you know, we're going to label this other thing.
And then it got picked up by, you know, the music industry at large.
I think because of some of the irreverence that the band members naturally had, that there was, it just sort of slid off everybody's back. It wasn't a big deal. Well, at first they didn't like it, but everybody was growing so fast at that point. They had other things on their mind to think about. Yeah, at the time, it just was a funny made-up term.
Ultimately, there wasn't a single band responsible for creating the grunge sound. Different bands were experimenting with punk, rock, and metal all at the same time, going to each other's shows and coming up with new ideas. It was angsty, it was raw, and it was real. Melvin's Green River and Mudhoney were some of the bands that laid the groundwork for later groups like Soundgarden, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains, but it's impossible to name just one as an innovator. In the next episode, we're going to dive more into the grunge sound and what made it and its key players different from previous generations of rock and roll.
None of us are interested in walking in the footsteps of other people.
Musically, it was a wall of sound. The musicianship was amazing.
It was way different than what was going on in the mainstream, and it was authentic.
It wasn't pretending. Like, it was so genuine and so real and so just, I don't give a fuck.
They sang about very uncomfortable subject matter, but necessary.
Everyone could relate to it in a way that I feel like music hadn't connected to people's souls like that in a long time.
I related to it in a big way. It had a lot to do with how I was feeling about life and my life.
It's the late 1980s, and the biggest rock bands in the world are at the peaks of their careers. Def Leppard's Hysteria, Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, and Aerosmith's Permanent Vacation all came out in 1987. Metallica were still healing from the loss of Cliff Burton and gave us And Justice for All the following year, and Motley Crue were about to drop Dr. Feelgood, their first #1 album. While all of this was going on, things were starting to bubble a bit up in the Pacific Northwest. However, the happenings in the area still hadn't drawn much attention outside of the local level yet. Hair metal and thrash were still the predominant genres in the world of heavy music, and you may have noticed there was a band I didn't mention earlier who also released an enormous album in 1987, Guns N' Roses. Though they were a Los Angeles band that tended to tease their hair in the early days, the media had a hard time pigeonholing Guns N' Roses once Appetite for Destruction started receiving massive attention. They weren't glam, but they weren't metal, and they weren't punk either. So what do Guns N' Roses have to do with grunge?
They're different from that whole glam thing. There's something more raw and more naturally charismatic, and their charisma didn't come in a hairspray can. I mean, I saw them at the Cat House because some A&R people said, "You got to see this band Guns N' Roses. Their record's about to go gold by the end of next week." Well, we've heard that Duff plays them. Chris and I go and see them. We're like, wow, they just had this presence. Slash, Duff, everyone in the band, Izzy, they just had this presence.
Because of what was going on in mainstream hard rock, I felt like in a way it started with Guns N' Roses, which was the beginning of what was bringing about this change, the sea change in a lot of ways. You had Guns N' Roses, and then we heard Jane's Addiction. Both LA bands, and they were doing something they were moving in a different direction. And you had Faith No More, and then we heard Soundgarden, and then so there was a thing that was brewing, and you could feel it. And I remember going and seeing Jane's Addiction in I think '90 or something, and you could really feel it. I was like, who are all these people coming to these shows? This is like it's like a subculture that you didn't know existed.
And I don't even look at Axl Rose even in the time era of that was glam. Guns N' Roses was a punk rock band. I don't care what anybody says.
The Guns N' Roses kicking down the door thing for a change was a really welcome thing because we needed danger in rock and roll again. But it was the thing that opened the door for the next movement at the same time, because as things were starting to kind of go in a direction where the bigger hair metal bands were on their 4th or 5th album, and it was hitting a wall. People were ready for something new. Obviously, youth was.
As Miles mentioned before, Jane's Addiction were another group that were breaking out of what was considered the norm at the time. In November of 1988, the group headlined a Rising Star show at the Paramount Theater in Seattle.
It was often the custom for the radio station to help the promoter with bands locally that were doing really well. And so the opening acts for that show were Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone. The energy in that show was at a fever pitch level that I had not experienced in a long time, if ever. I knew the music in our area was unique and special. It was that night at the Paramount that it was the realization that the rest of the world was soon going to be knocking on our door.
So if bands like Guns N' Roses and Jane's Addiction were preparing the world for something new and different, why was grunge what became popular next? What about its sound and attitude made it so different from what had been in the mainstream in the past?
I just think the thing that really attracted me to the music was its heaviness. I thought it was coming from a very honest place. They were all very individual, in my opinion. They were geographically linked together, and there was a lot about the attitude that comes from being there in the Pacific Northwest and having to trudge it out in the scene.
We kind of brought in a lot of different influences, and I think you can kind of see that in grunge, where it sort of straddled the line between punk and the sort of the new metal at the time. That was kind of appealing in the fact that it was something new for all of us. It wasn't just the sort of cliche hardcore or punk going on, and it wasn't the sort of cliche metal, hair metal.
That time frame and that time period, drums, bass, guitar, badass vocals, and a killer song. But you also had to be able to play. Like, you had to be able to cut it for real too. You know, you couldn't go back and, you know, fix stuff, or, oh, we'll do it in post, or I'll just fly this over to this. You know what I mean? Like, you had to play it. So there's so much integrity involved in that era of music.
When you consider what was big in hard rock at the time, we'd kind of moved from like the British wave of metal into like more of a lot. LA was definitely influencing things. There was more of a, I don't want to say a pop element, but it was certainly becoming more mainstream, right? With MTV and it was a massive thing. If you asked any of us at the time what we liked about it was dark. It was way different than what was going on in the mainstream, and it was authentic. You know, it just felt like they had something that was truly theirs, and it was really exciting, and it was really inspirational for us just over the hill.
For every genre of music, it speaks to a particular generation. The thing that struck me about the music that was coming out of Seattle is the raw authenticity of the artist, the lyrics. Each song is like, damn, that's a good song. The music was undeniable, regardless of what the magic ingredient. And I think the thing that makes Seattle so special is that there is no one ingredient.
They all played in the same genre, but they were all such vastly different sounding bands. And I think that was just, it was a good age for music, man.
As we discussed during episode 1, the term grunge came to be used by the media and the rest of the industry to simply label the sound that was being created by this group of bands. It just made it easier to classify them together. Let's hear what the members of some of these groups have to say about how they came to develop their musical identities.
There's just a difference in the way we write or play, but then when I look at what everyone's into, it's generally really similar. I mean, I go to when I visit these guys and I look at their record collection, it's just very similar.
To me, grunge music was fusing punk rock and hard rock. To the extent that I myself have an idea what that sounds like, Mother Love Bone was not making that sound.
We were trying to do what was natural for us, and none of us were interested in walking in the footsteps of other people. It wasn't really our nature. The way everyone had grown up, everyone's a little bit independent, a little bit rebellious, and that's not uncommon for young people who might be involved in music. But I think many people try to imitate or follow the patterns or formulas that they grew to learn or that they're familiar with, or to emulate what successful people have done or what their heroes have done. We had the insight that our heroes weren't emulating anybody. Why would we want to do that?
I don't think there was any conscious decision to try to sound a certain way. I was just trying to do what came natural. And with Soundgarden, I knew that we were a band that had a lot of imagination and that we were able to just kind of dive into our own artistic sensibilities, you know? We weren't trying to kill hair metal, although all of us fucking hated hair metal. We knew what we didn't want to do.
We haven't talked much yet about the most obvious aspect of this music, though. As melodic and complex as the instrumentation of some of these bands was, a lot of them were creating really brooding songs. Whether it was the slow tempos, the droning guitar riffs, or the gloomy subject matter of some of the lyrics, it's undeniable that there was a darkness to the music, which, in turn, made it relatable for a lot of its listeners.
It wasn't trying to be something that it wasn't. It wasn't trying to be arty or iconoclastic. It was simply what it was. And the thing about Seattle is it's a remote place. A lot has been made of this over the years, but it's true.
It was like a soundtrack to things weren't all right with you. You didn't feel all right. There might be some depression. There might be some inner anger. That genre of music really expressed a lot of those things, pain and self-doubt, depression. But it also kind of empowered you at the same time. But it was looking at things that were really uncomfortable for people and to look at. And it was, I think people had to realize that there was finally this group of artists that were writing about things that young people were feeling, that people in general were feeling when they were feeling uneasy, when they were feeling disenfranchised.
You know, they weren't talking about fast cars and partying, and they were talking about real life. They sang about very uncomfortable subject matter, but necessary.
It was part of the zeitgeist of the era. If you think about all these angry, disaffected youths, and then suddenly they get the soundtrack to their lives and they all rise up, and it's this huge sort of movement.
And if you heard it, your head went back, and everyone could relate to it in a way that I feel like music hadn't connected to people's souls like that in a long time. And that's why I took over, because you can't compete with, you can have all the money in the world, but you can't compete with soul music and music that really touches you in a way that, no other art form can. And I think that those bands really, really encapsulated that.
Yeah, it really kind of changed the idea of what music means to a certain demographic of youth, I think. And I think that's why it's still appealing to young kids today. There's a certain angst to the music that wasn't there before. It doesn't just celebrate partying or breakups or romance. There's more to it about sort of this internal state or the state of the nation, state of the world, that's kind of dark but somewhat insouciant as well. Like it takes it and has some humor and can make fun of it.
It wasn't pretending. Like, it was so genuine and so real and so just, I don't give a fuck. Like, just someone really venting their frustration or their pain or their emotions. It just felt so genuine and real. As a teenager, going through all those awkward things that we go through as teenagers, that was something I would hide away and get into because it just made me feel okay. Sometimes you have to expose the ugly parts of yourself before you can really call it art, because it's like, that is what's connecting people and helping them sort of heal through music. So when it's real and genuine and it just gets you, in your core, like that is the most important thing to me. And that's what I related to. And that's what I try to incorporate into my own music as well.
While most of the artists that later became popular embodied a lot of these emotions in their music, they each did it in their own distinct way. They were like fingerprints, seemingly similar on the surface, but all unique to each other when they're examined more closely. So we're going to dive in a bit and talk about what made some of these artists so special, starting with Nirvana, whose simplistic song structures served as the perfect introduction to grunge for someone who'd never heard it before.
Nirvana was by far the poppiest version of grunge. They were the catchy sing-along type grunge band. Like Soundgarden was more of a sort of, in my mind, more of a sludgy metal kind of band. Great music, but it wasn't necessarily as accessible as, Kurt described the Nirvana songs as nursery rhymes with heavy guitars.
I mean, the guitars on Nevermind are just so dangerous and trashy at some parts. It's kind of just throwing caution to the wind and just flipping out. Really, really simple, beautiful songwriting, really catchy. Almost like a pop song wearing a grunge suit in some cases.
Nirvana was the band that changed my entire life. And I distinctly remember being at Suzanne Rosenberg's bat mitzvah. I was 12. And all of a sudden, Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana came on. And that was it for me. My life was changed forever. I had never heard anything like that before. I can literally define my life into two parts, before and after discovering Nirvana. That was the impact that band had on me.
I liked that Kurt played. I loved the clean verses into heavy choruses, much like the Pixies, which inspired him. Everything about it felt sort of controlled chaos. It felt like it was haphazard, but it had meaning. I liked that the approach was kind of simplistic. I loved all of it, basically. There was not a single Nirvana song that I didn't like. All of it seemed to be played with passion, and that's the most important thing.
Well, we tried to talk our label into signing Nirvana because we were really into them. And we just wanted them to, we were like, there's nobody like us at A&M. I think they had 38 Special and The Police. So we wanted some people, like some brothers with us. Like, you got to sign Nirvana. I remember what they said to me. They said, well, we just signed you. We don't know how you're going to do. Why do we sign Nirvana? It's like, let's see how you guys do, before we, so we don't want to have two bands, or they're kind of similar. It's like, nah, they're different.
So I faked a stomach virus in school to get out of school. So my granny picked me up from school, but she had to work, so she dropped me off in my house. MTV was locked, so I couldn't watch it on like the cable box and stuff like that, but it wasn't locked at my granny's house. And that was when MTV did buzz-worthy videos. Saw Smells Like Teen Spirit from Nirvana, that video, for the very first time. And my whole world changed because I'd never seen anything like it. First of all, never heard anything like it. That was probably my first initial introduction to just grunge in general.
While we haven't quite gotten to the release of Smells Like Teen Spirit just yet, that was absolutely the song that introduced much of the world to Nirvana later on. But for now, we'll continue on with Soundgarden, who were extremely dynamic and creative, often used odd time signatures in their songs, and, of course, were fronted by one of the most powerful male vocalists to have ever touched a microphone.
Soundgarden, their music was much more sophisticated on weird time signatures and strange way they went about what they were doing, and strange way they wrote songs. Were a much weirder band, I thought, but they had a vocalist who sang on a more traditional level, regardless of how weird a songs he wrote.
Hey Matt, can you tell us why Soundgarden wrote songs in odd time signatures?
Good question. I think for me, when I first joined the band, Soundgarden had like 20 songs. I mean, they had a bunch of songs. Kim and Hiro just naturally wrote these weird angular guitar riffs that were in 5 and 7 and 6. And being a drummer that grew up, loving, prog rock and jazz, I loved that aspect of the band, that all the music was just kind of slightly different just because of the rhythm of it all. There was never any mention of it. It just like, if the riff was cool, if the song was cool, then that's how it goes. We never tried to like smooth it out for the listener or anything like that for the audience. So I think we just kind of did what we were hearing in our heads.
First time I heard Soundgarden, it's probably like 11 or 12 when I first heard them. It blew my mind, for lack of a better term. It was the first band I had heard in a long time, probably since the Beatles. That I just couldn't wrap my head around. The amount of layers, the amount of depth, the amount of complexity, the lyrics alone and the musicality, like it was the odd time signatures. Like, I don't even know where to start or end. It's just, Soundgarden's like an onion that you can just keep peeling away at and you still never get to the bottom of it. Like they're absolutely incredible. And just the power that I felt when I first heard them was, unparalleled to anything else I'd ever heard, and it changed a part of my view on music for forever.
The first time I heard like Soundgarden, which would have been, I think, 88 or 89, and my buddies and I here in Spokane, we really thought that was cool. We were like, wow, that's really cool. And we actually covered 2 of their songs off of the first record they did on A&M, which I think was Louder Than Love. I was just playing guitar at the time. I didn't sing much. I didn't want to be a singer, but I just loved the riffs. I thought it was cool. And obviously Chris Cornell, I mean, you ask most singers and they're going to tell you that Chris was, he's up here. He had an incredible gift.
A very powerful group. It was very, very powerful, visceral music, very hypnotic, and something that was hard to forget after you listened to the first time.
I think the thing about Soundgarden that I loved was, there was something absolutely classic about it in what I loved about heavy rock and roll, but a darker feeling, but it didn't feel forced or theatrical. And I was always drawn to dark music with a darker message, being, disenfranchised youth. That's, to me, the thing that was really interesting, what I ended up loving about a lot of the bands, especially Soundgarden and Alice in Chains.
3 people helped me find my voice: Chris Cornell, Nina Simone, Otis Redding. Like, those would be the 3. The first time I heard him sing, and yes, I was at my granny's house. Because the MTV, the cable box wasn't blocked. Outshined on Bad Motorfinger. First time I saw what he looked like, saw what the band looked like, and first time I heard his voice. I think that was the first time that I heard a male have that kind of a range, using his voice as an instrument. and the fact that he was such a skilled guitar player, and to have a voice like that and play guitar live, there's very few and far between people that can do that.
Now we've come to perhaps the most solemn of the bigger groups, Alice in Chains. Though we know from Susan Silver that they didn't actually come off as solemn people when they got off the stage. Jerry Cantrell's guttural guitar tone and introspective lyrics gave them a reputation for being gloomy, and his harmonies with Lane Staley, who was also an incredible vocalist, added an eerie flavor to their songs.
I think I saw Alice in Chains the first time in 88 or 89, if I'm not mistaken, opening for a band called the Bullet Boys. It was like a hotel, like convention area where this gig was, and this band Alice in Chains opened the show. They had the song that I remember was called Queen of the Rodeo, which didn't make it to the Facelift record, but it was a really great song. If my memory serves me correctly, this was before they made Facelift, and the songs were faster. I remember that. Then they came back and opened for another band at a little theater here, and I was at that show as well. When they came back that second time, it was just like a force of nature. It was just like, what have we just seen? This was incredible. The songs were slower, but it was more like, I don't know, it was intense. And that was when we really started to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. You know, it was pretty impressive. Lane Staley, like I said, seeing him the first few times was just a really powerful voice.
And Alice in Chains is a lot more sophisticated than people give him credit for, especially in the beginning. Those harmonies are insane. Like, if you have a chance, you can do it now because of technology and YouTube. Type it in and just put the isolated vocals and listen to them together without all the music and stuff like that, and listen to like how iconic that was, but also like some serious musicianship going on there.
One thing that these artists definitely had in common was their passion for the guitar. Prior to the grunge days, the talent of a guitarist was often measured by the speed they played at or how long they could solo for. This changed a bit when the grunge bands came along, especially when they started playing in drop D tuning.
I think grunge bands basically used guitar as melodic and percussive instruments. The emotional response is in the visceralness of the sound of the grunge guitars. Jerry Cantrell's playing is very, very sort of, it's also got like a primal feeling to it. Kim Thale and Soundgarden, that guy's as unique as you can get. There was definitely an emphasis on riffing. That was the whole point.
Guitar-wise, Kurt Cobain was he was a competent enough guitar player to get through what he needed to get through, and I always appreciated that kind of guitar playing. I don't really go for the heavily schooled, correct way of playing guitar anyway. I've never been interested in any of that. I'm not a school musician. There's a lot of weird tunings. Always have. I showed those guys that kind of tunings and Soundgarden those kinds of tunings, and they ran with it, loved it. They were smart enough to know it was a good thing.
I always played in standard tunings. I figured that was enough of a challenge. I think Mark and Buzz from the Melvins and I'm positive we were all hanging out. We all ended up in Mark's apartment in the U District. I lived in the U District. And then Buzz starts discussing songs we like by Sabbath. And then he mentions that song's in drop D. And what Mark and I are like, well, what's drop D? Do you tune everything from standard tuning with E all the way down to D? He goes, no, just the low string, just E down to D. So I went home, took the E string, dropped it to D, and then figured out where the octave was. And the sound was immediately, the string was a little bit more flexible, it was heavier, and I was making different chord positions. I just started writing these songs. I wrote the song Nothing to Say. I took it to practice and showed Hero and Chris this riff and showed them the tuning and told them about the conversation with Buzz. And it was just a bit of an epiphany. Everyone's like, wow. It just got us into stimulating our creativity and our songwriting by trying to tune the guitar in a different way and see what came out of it.
Okay, and what about solos? Did grunge kill the guitar solo?
I think grunge definitely had its fair share of solos. Again, Kurt played some beautiful solos on Nevermind. You've got great solos in Pearl Jam. You've got great solos in Soundgarden. You got killer solos in Alice in Chains. It just wasn't fast solos. Their emphasis was on melodic solos that were beautiful. You could remember them. You could hum along to them. You could. They were almost extensions of the vocal melody line. I think solos were extremely important to grunge music. I think really the solo died with the new metal bands.
It became more about a riff, and it became more about from a guitar nerd perspective, like a subversive riff. Like, because some of that stuff with Soundgarden, it's not straightforward. It's complicated. A lot of those riffs, there's time signatures, and they did a lot of that stuff. And I think the glam rock was built on like a simple framework, but like complicated guitar soloing. It got flipped with the 90s stuff.
I hated soloing when we started. I thought that was one of the terrible things. I mean, I could play really fast and do all these triplets, and it just annoyed me. It's one of the things, I would listen to like this really cool groove or riff, and then the guitar solo would come on. I go, just wait for a minute till that ended. So it got back to the cool groove, which included bands I loved like Sabbath and Zeppelin. Yeah, I tried avoiding soloing, and it's fine because most other musicians didn't like it. They didn't want to hear the guitars be all self-indulgent. It annoyed drummers, it annoyed bass players, and of course it created some competition for the singer. But when we started writing things that were kind of trippy and psychedelic, we were naturally inclined to kind of explore the feedback of the drones. So our guitar solos and leads would consist of me standing by the amp and making feedback, or banging my guitar, or just plucking the strings beneath the bridge. And these weird sounds that added a trippy, more of a color. It was more color guitar than lead guitar. But then eventually, you get around to that. Eventually you start, Chris would write songs like, here's the section that's the solo. Write something for the guitar solo. Do I have to? Well, I kind of think it'd be really cool if you do a guitar solo there, Play that fast shit you do. And I was like, oh, okay.
So, no, grunge didn't kill the guitar solo, but at least we really know how Kim felt about them now. Now that we've broken down what made grunge a bit more, we can get back to the timeline of how things started to boil for these bands. Soundgarden were the first of the groups that signed to a major label, A&M Records, and were gearing up to release their sophomore album, Louder Than Love. Alice in Chains followed suit and signed with Columbia shortly after, and Mother Love Bone signed with a subsidiary of Polygram. Nirvana had their debut album Bleach underway, but were still with Sub Pop, as were Mudhoney and Melvins. Of the aforementioned groups, Alice in Chains were the first to have an album reach the top 50 of the Billboard 200 with their 1990 debut album Facelift, which featured the mega hit Man in the Box. Several other bands in the area would eventually achieve massive commercial success as well, which we'll get to in the next installment of this series. But how prepared were they for this lifestyle change? Did these people want to become rich and famous, or did they scoff at the idea of becoming rock stars?
It's just like humans, we all have different ways of looking at things and different hopes and dreams. Alice in Chains and Andy Wood of Mother Love Bone, already in their minds, they were successful. They had very little need to do things the slow, pay your dues way.
They worked towards becoming rock stars, regardless of what they said. Or what they may or may not have said. That's what they wanted to do. They plugged themselves into the same venues, managers, record labels as anyone else, as Motley Crue or anyone else. It's not really a whole lot different along those lines.
It was kind of interesting when those underground bands kind of went to major label status. That can sometimes change the overall identity of a band. When we did sign to a major label, one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because we really believed in our band. We did want a bigger audience, not for necessarily fame and fortune. We would love to be able to pay our rent playing gigs, and that eventually did happen. We tried to have success on our own terms, I guess is what you could say.
I think people just reacted as human beings. A lot of people started out not partying, and guess what? They started partying. I don't think there was anything particularly unique about what happened to the city as soon as a number of the musicians became famous.
We were leaning into that pretty hard. For myself, I could say there was not an insignificant amount of anxiety based on that, maybe, being a little freaked out by, whoa, this train is leaving the station. And at the time in the Seattle scene, there was a little bit of baked in anti-industry sentiment, which was, in a few short years converted after so many bands from here were having success outside of the region.
Unfortunately, Mother Love Bone's story came to an abrupt end soon after they recorded their first album, Apple. But out of the ashes of tragedy rose a group called Mookie Blaylock, which we'll talk about next time, along with how they became part of a scene that was on the brink of explosion.
There's no light switch that suddenly flipped. People like to talk about it being an overnight success. It was at least a 10-year overnight success. So
it just set it up for the audience who was not being addressed. And Nirvana comes out, boom, metal, punk, indie, alternative. It's like, here we are.
By 91, it just exploded, and none of us expected it to have that much of an impact on not just music, but pop culture.
I mean, 91 was just one of the greatest years for rock albums, period.
There is a year in particular, and that is 1991, and the date is September 24th, 1991. It might be the greatest album release date in history.
I think whenever you take a genre of music and you make it catchy and you make it something that it gets stuck in your head, that's how you elevate it from underground to mainstream.
1991 was undeniably one of the greatest years in rock and roll history. Several of the core bands we've been focusing on in this series would go on to release their breakthrough albums and take over the music industry and pretty much the world. Nirvana's Nevermind in particular is known by many as the album that made grunge blow up. But there were a couple of different factors that set the stage for the explosion. So let's hear from those who were there how it really happened.
A journalist who goes by the name of Everett True, who worked for the Melody Maker. Bruce and I endeavored to fly him over in exchange for some cover space and a feature story in Melody Maker, which was one of 3 big music weeklies at the time. And getting in those magazines, we knew was going to be a big thing.
it really was the English press that broke those bands. Mudhoney and Tad and I think Nirvana went to England, and the English press wrote about this Seattle explosion, this fabulous spread, and NME and Melody Maker and local press in Seattle paid attention after that. So then the band started to get local press, which and then raise the numbers in the audience and raise the opportunities to open for other larger touring groups.
The push that I had to do in music was talking to other radio stations. It was safer to get the next release from a proven artist than to jump on to bands that were new. So a lot of my conversations were programmers at other radio stations and saying, no, this is the real deal. And where there's a Soundgarden, there's an Alice in Chains. And where there's a Mother Love Bone, there's a Temple of the Dog and Pearl Jam.
There's a lot of factors that happen, culminating in the success of Nirvana Nevermind. But there are things that set that up. Well, one, our success, we signed to a major label. That was a big deal in that, until people start looking at it, they see it. There's a whole bunch of bands like, we get signed, and other labels come to see what else is around Seattle. Love Bone gets signed, Nirvana gets signed, Tad goes on to another label. But outside of Seattle, those doors were opened by bands like the Beastie Boys, Metallica, and Jane's Addiction, and Faith No More. The record companies are still not cluing into the fact that there was an audience there that grew up with, Joy Division and the Meat Puppets and Bauhaus and Wire and Black Flag. They were still looking for a new Beatles or another Aerosmith.
The slow build from the early 80s on, it was just a matter of time. I think everywhere it's the same story, the same thing happens, that there's an evolution of culture and consciousness that's building toward something, and finally that reaches a critical state.
Everything up until that point, there's no light switch that suddenly flipped. People like to talk about it being an overnight success. It was at least a 10-year overnight success. So everything happened very incrementally.
Needless to say, there were a lot of great things happening for the scene, but some of them spelled devastation for many of the members of it. Mother Love Bone were seen by many locals as the next big band, and in March of 1990, they were just days away from releasing their debut album Apple when the unthinkable happened. Frontman Andrew Wood's fiancée Xana found him unresponsive at home, and he was rushed to the hospital where he spent several days in a coma until his loved ones made the decision to say goodbye.
He was a great guy. He was just awesome and funny, and making music with him was easy. You could always count on him to just come up with something. He was great to play with because that something was substantial. He had a bigger than life stage persona. He was a big presence in the room, but at the same time, you might reflect on it later and think and realize, we didn't actually know that guy. He kept a lot of things close to the vest or buried.
So I met those guys, I think at a Malfunction gig or something at the Central Tavern. So we were just kind of always acquaintances. We never really played music together or hung out that much. But once he was Chris's roommate, I started seeing him a lot more when I would go over to band practice. And he had a big smile, big hug, super warm, great personality. Funny is just wicked funny.
He was 24 years old, and his death was a result of complications from a heroin overdose, a tragedy that has plagued rock and roll for decades.
I was not aware of that there was a problem there. He was not, did not fit, sort of your classic idea of someone with a drug problem. If you didn't know, it's kind of like if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. We were told by other people close to him, and actually, I guess there were people in our camp that knew more than I did. So that's really all I could talk about is my own personal ignorance about it. I was not aware. I was not aware until he was going to rehab. I was aware that when we were in Sausalito recording that there was some concern, some issue with keeping Andy out of the city.
It was a absolute kick in the gut to the entire community. And I go back to that moment as to when things changed, when the rest of the world was coming to our doorstep, whether we wanted it to or not. And sometimes the price is quite steep.
While this loss was horrific for all of Andrew's comrades in the Seattle community, his family, and of course his fiancée Xana, it hit his roommate and close friend Chris Cornell, who was on tour at the time with Soundgarden, in a bit of a different way. He began writing songs that he knew wouldn't fit in with Soundgarden's catalog, and approached some of Andrew's bandmates in Mother Love Bone to see about putting them together.
We were on tour when we heard Andrew passed away. Chris was crushed. It hit him really, really hard. When we got back from that tour, he started writing material that would eventually become the Temple the Dog album.
Lost Andy Wood in early 1990. Part of the healing process for Chris was to write a couple beautiful songs in his honor. That was all it was meant to be. It was just a couple songs.
He gave me a cassette of Say Hello to Heaven and Reach Down, and he did everything on drum machine and guitar and bass on his 4-track. Gave the cassette to me, and then he gave it to Jeff and Stone, who had lost their band, lost their singer.
And they were really moved, and they were moved to then write some of their own music and then get together and play some of those songs that Chris and Stone had written.
There was a lot more that came about when we did get together. So I think the floodgates kind of opened when we all got in a room together.
It was absolute magic. It was 11 days and the most beautiful, beautiful record came out of it. It was very cathartic for everybody.
The result was a 10-track album released in April of 1991, which featured songs that were both beautifully melodic and emotionally powerful at the same time. Cornell's vocals shone in a way that they hadn't previously on Soundgarden's various releases, and on one song in particular, he was joined by another singer who would also become one of the leaders of the scene, Eddie Vedder, a surfer from San Diego who had flown up to Seattle to join Jeff Ament, Stone Gossard, and Mike McCready's new band, Mookie Blaylock.
Stone and Jeff were getting the nucleus together for Pearl Jam. I think it was around that time when they were definitely writing tunes with Eddie. He had just come up to, audition for Stone and Jeff, and Mike. Yeah, so the whole thing kind of came together around the same time. I believe it was an invite from Chris to sing on this one song, Hunger Strike, and Eddie destroyed it. He delivered. Chris is just the god singer. But then you got this other guy coming in there singing a verse, and it was cool. It was really cool. But it was one of those things that Chris pretty much put that thing together, and then Stone came in and wrote some fucking great songs as well. So it was a good indicator of things to come for the Pearl Jam guys, and it really highlighted a different side of Chris's songwriting that wasn't apparent in Soundgarden.
That was a great record. Maybe one of the better records to have come out of this whole grunge.
Temple the Dog, that's a really great one. The whole Pearl Jam thing is fascinating because we knew of Mother Love Bone, and Mother Love Bone was they were the ones that were going to explode. That was the horse that a lot of people were betting on. And then Andrew passed away. And so to hear how Chris worked through that with some of those songs is really beautiful.
It was the way Seattle honors its own, and has done so again and again and again. And then to have the members, some of the surviving members of Mother Love Bone, decide to continue forward and coalesce and create a new artist, a new band with a lead singer that is not Andrew too, but is a superstar in his own right. The excitement for Pearl Jam's debut release certainly was highly anticipated.
Singing together on Hunger Strike was the start of a decades-long friendship for Chris Cornell and Eddie Vedder, and they performed it together on several occasions throughout the years. Though the Temple of the Dog album failed to chart initially, it was part of a series of albums that the bands we've been discussing all along put out in 1991. Screaming Trees released Uncle Anesthesia in January, Tad put out 8-Way Santa a month later, Melvins released Bullhead in May, Mudhoney had Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge in July, and finally, we've come to August, which had a couple of pivotal moments. Mookie Blaylock decided to change their name when they signed to Epic Records to avoid any legal disputes, and they went with Pearl Jam, after Eddie Vedder's grandma Pearl and her homemade jam that was laced with peyote. However, when they released their debut album, they continued paying tribute to the basketball player their band was initially named after by naming it after his jersey number, 10.
After Mother Love Bone broke up, everybody just kind of went their separate ways. Jeff and Stone had a history that started way back, long before Mother Love Bone. It was natural for them to end up working together.
Like Eddie kind of took the band in a different direction, I think. They sort of lost the scarves and the accoutrements and whatnot, and just became more of a kind of a grounded regular rock band than Mother Love Bone was.
I think the songs were different from Mother Love Bone. I think they had a little more of a kind of a rock edge, there's definitely more guitar rock. The 10 album, a lot of those songs Stone wrote, and those, Stone and Jeff and Mike, they sort of changed their sound a little bit to fit Eddie. I think they were really keen on using his strengths, and it was one of those situations where it was good from the very beginning, obviously.
Since many of the songs were already put together prior to Eddie Vedder joining, the recording process was a swift one, and they released 10 on August 27th. The lyrics on the record covered a lot of ugly topics. Even Flow was about a homeless man, Wygo dealt with psychiatric facilities, Jeremy was about a boy who shot himself in front of his classmates at school. It was completely different from what Mother Love Bone had done, but it was fantastic in its own realm.
Wow. the gift that Eddie Vedder has provided all of us musically. Pearl Jam 10 is, to me, a unique release. But when it penetrates your soul, your musical soul, 10 is a release that can be compared to the Abbey Road of Seattle, the Dark Side of the Moon, the record that is complete as a unit from the first track to the last.
Another piece of music released on August 27th of 1991 was, drum roll please, Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. And while it was not an instant success, it received heavy rotation on some radio stations in the US, and the country slowly but surely started looking at Seattle.
When Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, we knew something was happening. First of all, everybody was talking about the song, and it was like a perfect storm. It changed everything. When that song came out, both the rock format in radio and the alternative format merged. All of a sudden, it changed everything. Grunge changed that completely.
There was a lot of great records and a lot of hard work in touring and momentum. But that song and its impact was so spectacularly huge that was really something happens once in a generation. And I really think that blew everything up.
You knew that there were a lot of people like myself, like my friends in the band I was in, who wanted, they wanted something different than what we were getting from MTV. It was time. It was time for a change. And then Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, and it was just, it was on.
Nirvana had recruited Dave Grohl on the drums the year prior, and they became even more of a powerhouse trio than they were originally. With their sophomore album in mind and the desire to sell more albums than Bleach did on Sub Pop, they sought advice from Susan Silver and signed with a major label. Kurt Cobain knew he wanted to make a record with more pop hooks this time around, and is quoted as having said he wanted to sound like the Knack and Bay City Rollers getting molested by Black Flag and Black Sabbath. September 24th, 1991 was the day Nirvana unleashed the second album.
It just set it up for the audience who was not being addressed. And Nirvana comes out, and boom, metal, punk, indie, alternative. It's like, here we are, we're just waiting for you to make a record we like. And they put out a record they liked, and there it went. And then all the Seattle bands started getting attention as well.
It was the sound of Nirvana, but then MTV was everything. And it was the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit that just solidified everything for me. Kurt also happened to be gorgeous, so that was an added bonus. But I think that it was the fact that he was effortlessly cool. It was such a juxtaposition to all of the larger-than-life rock bands that had been in the mainstream up until this point. With the big hair and the studs and the belts and the pants. And Kurt was so unkempt and so raw and so vulnerable. And to me, that was just the most badass. And I think the fact that he was so approachable or accessible or relatable that made him so powerful.
And seeing somebody for the first time on television, the awesome thing about it was, he looked homeless, you know what I mean? And here he is with his guitar, and but the voice that came out of him, this was every single person on the planet, real kids in America and in different countries all over the world. This idea that you didn't have to look like some kind of with rock music, it was all the teased hair and the glam and everything like that. He didn't look like that, Eddie Vedder didn't look like that.
I think whenever you take a genre of music and you make it catchy and you make it something that is easily memorable and it gets stuck in your head, that's how you elevate it from underground to mainstream. And it didn't hurt that they were also signed to a major label. Butch Vig produced it, so they had a whole bunch of elements that pushed them in that direction. Probably the main reason why a band like Nirvana broke open was because every single song is catchy. Basically, and especially Nevermind didn't have a single filler on it. That whole album to me was powerful from the first to the last track. When I first heard it, I listened to it back to back 17, 18 times nonstop because I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever heard. So, and maybe it was because it was kind of like a heavy Beatles,
I think Kurt Cobain had an ability to put together simplistic songs in a way that was very appealing to lots of people.
One of the moments that really blew it up was, Nevermind. That was an indicator that, there's these weird underground rock bands from the Northwest that actually write songs that sound fucking great on the radio and that kids are just totally into.
It was crazy. I mean, I remember just like going to a local store at the time and hearing Nevermind over the sound system. And at the time it was like, oh wow, if this record sells 100,000 copies, it's huge. But little did we think it would go on to sell millions of copies.
The moment that felt most defining, when Nevermind knocked Michael Jackson out of Billboard #1, and I remember we were on the Soundgarden tour at that time, and it just stopped us all in our tracks. We were on the tour bus and we got the news. Okay, this is significant.
Of course, we can't forget that Soundgarden also released a breakthrough album the same day Nevermind came out, Bad Motorfinger. By this point, the band had recruited Ben Shepherd in place of Hiro Yamamoto, and the members of Soundgarden were impressed by how well their new bassist's artistic visions matched their own.
Hiro was a huge part of Soundgarden early on. But, eventually he got, I guess, bored, or just he wasn't interested in, being on the road, being on tour. He had other interests in life. One of the impressive things about Ben Shepherd, one of the many impressive things, is like when he came into our band, we were sort of like at our creative peak almost. I was writing songs, Kim was writing songs, Chris was writing like just the greatest songs of his career. And then Ben comes in with like all this material that's like that fits perfectly with what we're doing. It just became a little more artistically free. Like we had more kind of like, areas that we could go in musically with Ben in the band.
Bad Motorfinger certainly signified a shift for Soundgarden. While there were still songs written in odd time signatures and there was still a heavy punk metal edge to a lot of them, tracks such as Outshined and Rusty Cage started to get picked up by radio stations. As Nirvana gained momentum, more songs were being played by Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains on the radio. Their videos were put into rotation by MTV, and they were eventually featured as guests on shows such as Headbangers Ball. Again, it wasn't an overnight success, but this was how and when the bands really started getting traction. In the following months, rock and roll and Seattle itself experienced some pretty drastic changes.
I mean, it was something that could not be ignored. So even people that were maybe stuck and just wanted to play, hair metal or things like that, or just old rock, could not ignore the revolution that was taking place with the Seattle bands. Because what happened was, when Nirvana came out, then all of a sudden people started looking at some of the other bands, and some of the alternative stations played Facelift, some did not, even though Alice in Chains got worked at both. But it set up everything, because all of a sudden people were really looking at Seattle when they exploded. They were taking a second look at Soundgarden if they did not understand it the first time around. Bad Motorfinger started to get exposure, and people were playing. Outshined, Jesus Christ Pose, Rusty Cage.
But yeah, Nirvana took off, and then those that maybe weren't on board with the major label attention that was coming to Seattle because of Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone now came because of Nirvana. They started signing up anything Seattle.
Suddenly it was not cool to be commercial in any way. I mean, like as far as commercial, people would critique you and say, oh, your stuff's too commercial. It has too much of a pop thing or whatever. If it was obvious that you were going for the golden ring, then you were suddenly kind of ostracized. And that was really interesting. Whereas in certain periods, just a few years prior, it was about, trying to embrace what was cool at the moment. And suddenly it became obvious that there was a complete reaction to all of that, and you didn't want to have anything to do with it.
And because of the success of Nevermind, every record label on the planet wanted their own Nevermind, and bands that really had no business going on playing stadiums or going out in tour buses and stuff were suddenly given that opportunity. For better or worse, I think. Some rose to it, and others, it probably ruined them more than it helped them.
As far as how the community changed, I think a lot of people moved here to get a record deal. A lot of people moved here to be part of this unique experience.
Many people also look at grunge as the sole thing that killed hair metal. Big hair, animal print, and colored spandex were replaced with flannels, oversized clothing, and Doc Martens. But most importantly, grunge showed the world that music didn't have to be flashy to be great.
Grunge killed the cartoon rock star. Because like the 80s had really just like everything that started to be born in the 70s, sort of like with Queen, with Freddie, with Kiss, with just the, you know, the grandiose, you know, the spandex rocker, the glam rocker. It got so cartoonish. The grunge showed us that.
Like the big hair that was going on in the mid to late 80s with a lot of bands, that was suddenly, you know, that was not cool anymore. And like lyrically, like if you were singing about fast cars and girls and like that wasn't cool. Like, and lyrically things were really cool during that period, you know, like how Kurt Cobain would approach things, because it was very fragmented and you didn't understand everything that was being conveyed, but you knew it was there was something in there that was really profound, and more than anything, the melodies were so good it didn't matter.
Well, hair metal was it felt like silly and positive and fun. It was just like party music, right? I don't know why it took a turn the way it did, but it went from like one extreme to the other. Like how it went from that to that, I have no fucking idea, but I'm glad it did. Now we have both. We have two great moments in rock music that are equally enjoyable, and it's what mood are you in today, you know?
You know, rock has always been kind of very cyclical, and it has its time in the sun, but overall it's always been kind of an underground art form. And if you look at it throughout history, you know, like there's Renaissance periods of rock and roll. Like if you look at the 60s and the 70s, that was a Renaissance period of rock and roll. And then the 80s came in and you know, and pop music kind of took over again, and the rock bands started to kind of follow suit to the pop artists. And so when the 90s came in, the grunge bands, like they came in with, there was no glitz and glamour, there was no showmanship, there's none of that, you know, there's none of that glam 80s rock, like where, you know, it wasn't about what they were wearing or what they were doing, it was about what they were saying. And they came in with such a force of just guttural, primal, pure and utter power that, you know, was just honest.
It was more dangerous than the safe party music of the hair metal that was happening at that period of time. You know, when you're doing a song, I was talking about a song breaking through a rusty cage or something that is almost considered by many sacrilege to do Jesus Christ pose. I mean, those things, you know, freaked some people out, as rock and roll's always done and should do in some ways.
I think grunge cut into hairspray cells for sure. Like the Nirvana song, Come As You Are, I think that kind of summed it up. It appealed to kids on a deeper level, I think, than the fashion, the style, even though then, of course, it was compromised to become a fashion.
I mean, it's common knowledge that I don't think he meant to do it. It's just what happened, that Kurt Cobain literally eliminated a genre of music, ultimately with one album.
It's a really good example of what was happening with Pearl Jam was, you know, they all of a sudden MTV started getting behind Alive and then Even Flow. And then by the time the Jeremy video came out, when you look at the videos that were out at that period of time and this, you know, the things that are really related to that period of grunge and how just incredibly dark those videos were, whether it Smells Like Teen Spirit or whether it's Man in the Box, or like something like Jeremy.
Though a lot of the Seattle bands started to feel the effects of their increasing popularity by the end of 1991, they didn't quite realize just how big they were actually going to get. In the next episode, we'll talk about some of the killer albums that were released in the following years, newer grunge bands that started breaking into the mainstream, and unfortunately, how fame and fortune caused a lot of these musicians to burn out and fade away.
One of the biggest records that changed my life is Super Unknown from Soundgarden.
And I was just playing it for people, and everyone was just like, dude, this is next level.
And it was unbelievable to see just how people were reacting to Pearl Jam at that period of time.
At a certain point, you can love something to death, or you can strangle the very essence it needs to breathe.
Because look at what we do, it's pretty intense. Like getting up in front of thousands and thousands of people and then exposing yourself to criticism. It can be pretty scary, but
it's not a unique story. It's not a unique story to rock and roll in general. It's been happening since the 60s.
By 1992, grunge was becoming more and more popular as time went on. Nirvana's Nevermind reached the top of the albums chart in January, knocking Michael Jackson's Dangerous from the top. MTV was playing their videos, as well as Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains regularly. Record labels scrambled to find their own version of Nirvana so they could release their own Nevermind. The Cameron Crowe-directed film Singles featured cameos from several Seattle musicians. And grunge fashion was now a fashion.
This bizarre fascination with their fashion. Like, what is that about? When the New York Times comes a call-in and they want to know, let's talk about the band's fashion. There was not a lot of fashion sense, conscious fashion sense going into the bands that became popular in the 90s.
As far as fashion, grunge fashion, Jesus criminy. I remember the first time I saw Eddie's equivalent of the brown denim jacket that he wore so much on tour on the runway during Fashion Week in New York. And I was just like, oh, dear God. The commercialism and the fashion statements and the Doc Martens and the flannel. Okay, all right, I'll acknowledge that the Seattle music and how we just did what we wanted and wore what we wanted and really didn't make a big deal out of it. If we did, it was usually in parody. The fact that influenced fashion all the way up to, New York's fashion stage. Okay, yeah, we're badasses, but it wasn't by design. Good Lord.
The flannels and oversized coats didn't actually make it to the runways until 1993, though. So we need to back it up a little bit, because there are a couple of imperative things that happened toward the end of 92. Firstly, Pearl Jam's 10 peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200 nearly a year after its release. This was the second grunge album to make it into the top 10 of the chart, and the group headlined that year's Lollapalooza festival alongside Soundgarden, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Jesus and Mary Chain, and more.
When Pearl Jam blew up, and out of nowhere, when they first were booked on the bill for Lollapalooza, they were booked early in the afternoon, like before bands that were bigger at the time. But the thing was, they blew up so fast because of radio play that when the band would start the set, like with even flow, all of a sudden people would swell the stage out of nowhere, and they would have one of the biggest crowds of the day. And it was unbelievable to see just how people were reacting to Pearl Jam at that period of time.
And of course, a month later, Alice in Chains put out perhaps one of the greatest releases from this era in music, the iconic, dark, and foreboding Dirt. Alice had already established themselves as one of the gloomier bands with their debut Facelift 2 years prior, but Dirt took it to a whole new level. Loneliness, depression, and hopelessness were some of the main topics discussed in Lane Staley and Jerry Cantrell's lyrics throughout the album, but the most prominent was addiction. In an interview Staley did with Rolling Stone, he noted that the record basically tells the story of someone who used drugs to deal with pain and anguish and how much it helped, but eventually realized over time that they're actually hurting him more than helping. That story was about Staley himself. He hoped to send the message to his fans that drugs don't actually solve the problems for you. Dirt peaked at number 6 on the albums chart just a few weeks after its release, but we do need to touch on another album that came out that same day, Stone Temple Pilots' Core. Though they were from San Diego, Stone Temple Pilots certainly could have been mistaken for a Seattle band when they first arrived in the scene. However, just as Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden all sounded vastly different from each other, so did STP, and Scott Weiland's confident onstage demeanor set him apart from the frontmen of the other groups.
And then you got to think about the bands that weren't from Seattle, but also, were great bands that, came out in that era, like the Pumpkins and Stone Temple Pilots. I mean, I love those bands. And there was that effect as well. I mean, of everything that was kind of happening at the time. You know, like when Dean DeLeo from Stone Temple Pilots came to my radio station in New Jersey, he was still driving a delivery truck. He was back in New Jersey working for the time being. They just finished Core, and he had a copy of Core in a long box. And he said, hey, man, hey, we got signed to Atlantic, me and my brother Robert, and we got this band called Stone Temple Pilots. I remember being the first person to ever play Stone Temple Pilots on the radio because he brought that record he just got it. I had to break open the long box with the plastic around it.
The fall of 1993 gave us the next two major releases from Seattle: Nirvana's third and final studio album In Utero on September 13th, and Pearl Jam's Verses on October 19th. Both albums peaked at number 1 on the Billboard 200 within weeks of their release, and then a couple of months later, Alice in Chains' 1994 EP Jar of Flies, which was their first release featuring new bassist Mike Inez, became the first EP to ever top the chart. While all of these accolades would seem to be a great feat for any band, this extremely sudden success was beginning to take its toll on various members of the Seattle scene.
I think they felt they were losing control at some point of things. And when things got so big, certainly I think that, Kurt was really conflicted. I think at this time where he wanted to be the biggest rock star in the world, but then he felt guilty about it because he came from this indie scene and kind of loathed a lot of the bands that had gotten really huge. There's that confliction with Kurt Cobain, but Kurt embraced it, but I think it happened so fast it was very, very hard for him. Eddie Vedder handled it a very different way, which was pretty amazing. Like he, decided that after things really started to blow up, that they were going to take control of their own career and not make videos anymore. They didn't make videos for years. Well, he didn't want to do things that he felt like the industry had pushed him into doing it. So he decided after Jeremy had blown up so big, they weren't going to do videos. And then when Versus came out, it sold 950,000 copies in the first week, which I think was a record at that time for a first week album sale.
There's sort of a meteoric rise in the success of Pearl Jam and Nirvana experience. It was primarily from videos and radio airplay. They hadn't really done the kind of touring that, say, we had done. We're still growing at a slower rate. We're doing what we do. We have songs that are certainly more radio friendly than many other bands because we did have some radio and MTV success. We didn't have that kind of success that Nirvana or Pearl Jam had for video. I think the biggest strength from our video success was, hey, cute lead singer, which seemed to work in the 80s. That, of course, that wasn't the goal. We didn't go out and take a hammer and chisel and make Chris look that way. He just did. So yeah, we because we weren't as huge, they can make decisions like pull back on radio or pull back on video. We couldn't quite do that same thing because we still needed that as a vehicle to promote ourselves, and we still had to keep touring and doing the interviews and then writing. So yeah, it was different for us.
Soundgarden may not have reached the same level as Pearl Jam and Nirvana as quickly, but in March of 1994, they released their most commercially successful album to date, Super Unknown, which became their first #1 album and earned them 2 Grammy Awards with the hits Black Hole Sun and Spoon Man.
Well, there was pressure from the record label to use a name producer. We used Michael Beinhorn, but Chris and Kim they really wanted to fine-tune stuff. Ben and I kind of did our parts pretty quickly at the beginning, and then we just kind of handed it over to Kim and Chris. That we made clear from the get-go is like, okay, we kind of produce ourselves. We definitely took, we did take input. We weren't like completely bad to work with in that sense, but we never let anyone there was never any talk of like, oh, can you change the chorus? Can you shorten up the bridge? Can you take out, it's like, no. No one ever had that conversation with us, which I always thought was really cool. I do remember after Brendan O'Brien mixed the album, we all had a couple beers and smoked a joint or something, and we blasted the album at the studio we're working at. And I remember leaving leaving that listening session and just thinking, damn, we fucking did it.
One of the biggest records that changed my life, just the way that I view songwriting, specifically songwriting, is Super Unknown from Soundgarden. I mean, anyone that knows me knows how much of an affection I have for that band, especially Chris Cornell. Earlier Soundgarden albums, you could tell that he was trying to kind of find his footing, but when Super Unknown came out, it was just front to back. Like, what in the hell is this beautiful piece of art? Like, this is amazing.
And those bands were obviously not all that comfortable with the success. I think the other thing that, we have to think about is the reason why we've lost so many members of those bands is because, they had to go out and they had to live their pain, their emotional and physical abuse they had been through. They had to live it every night, because I think the thing about the bands was that they were writing about real things they felt. That was an extension of what was really going on in their minds and in their souls. And it's a really hard thing, I think, for some people to live that every single night, and it could take its toll. And I think that's why so many people had gotten into drug abuse, and just trying to get out of themselves, so they're not living that pain, because a lot of times artists can't separate who they are, from the person on the stage.
I wonder if creatives, because they are so much more sensitive, they kind of surf a broader range of emotions more quickly, more on a regular basis, so they can see more up and down. I don't want to make that connection without data and information. But I have heard that said before, and it does seem like artists are a little off. I don't know why.
As unfortunate as it is to say, drugs were a big part of the Seattle scene. Mother Love Bone's Andrew Wood, who we discussed in the last episode, certainly wasn't the only victim of addiction. After Nevermind became massive, Kurt Cobain admitted to having an on and off relationship with heroin in interviews. However, Nirvana manager Danny Goldberg told the LA Times that he seemed to really want to get clean and stay clean when his and Courtney Love's daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born in 1992. But in March of 1994, Cobain was rushed to a hospital in Rome, Italy after Love found him on the floor. He'd ingested alcohol and a large amount of pills and slipped into an overdose-induced coma. Love also recalled he'd been severely depressed when he first arrived in Italy. She was convinced that he intentionally overdosed to kill himself. Sometime in the following weeks, Love and some of Cobain's other comrades set up an intervention with him. Love had struggles of her own, so she flew down to LA and checked into rehab, and he followed suit shortly after. However, he didn't stay long, and on April 8th, he was found dead in his greenhouse from a gunshot wound.
The people that they associated themselves with on a business level were not around when things were starting out, and certainly saw no interest in us or any reason why we should be considered anything other than an annoyance. And I think that kind of translated into their heads as well to some degree, although it's not Kurt's, because he died so young. And I can happily say without any trouble that I didn't like most of the people that were around. I didn't like the people that were surrounding him, that they were paying to do their business for him. I wasn't excited about any of that. So kind of ruined the whole thing. And then you put the drugs into all of it and how it all ended. I don't have a lot of happy memories about any of that stuff. It's clouded by a weird tapestry of tragedy. We were getting off a plane from the tour that we had just been on with them, which was not a happy time. They played their very last show, which was in Munich. We played it with them, and then they canceled the next day and canceled the rest of the shows we were going to do with them. We went on to do our own tour after that. When we landed in the U.S., we found out from our road manager who met us at the airport that's what had happened. It's just a terrible thing. I wish it had ended differently. But honestly, I wish that he would never have been famous and was still alive, because we were friends long before any of that stuff happened. When everybody was penniless. I'd much rather have him that way and alive than dead and the history of Nirvana, personally.
The day that Kurt died, and it was just such I remember just the way everybody felt. The shock was incredible. And, you know, I mean, little did we know what would come down the line, losing more people from the scene. But that was just, it was a really horrible thing. I think that Kurt would have gone and done a lot of different things and gone in a lot of different directions. I think Nirvana would have experimented with other different sounds. I think they were already considering doing different things.
The crazy thing is I'd seen him a couple weeks earlier, and he'd given me his phone number, and I actually woke up that morning thinking, you know, I should call Kurt. Courtney was always kind of bugging me to go because Kurt needed better friends, she said. And I'm like, yeah, I'll give him a call. And I'm like, it's only 10 a.m. I'll give him another hour or two at least. And then the phone rang, and that was Entertainment Weekly. And then call waiting was Rolling Stone. And then it just sort of went like that. By that Friday, when I had everything out and there was nothing to be done for the weekend, I went and had a nice dinner by myself and just kind of, broke down.
I was in shock, but I was not surprised. He had been OD'd in Rome just a month before. It still puts you in shock. You love these people, you care about these people.
The loss of Kurt Cobain, for many people, I wouldn't say locally, but for many people would signify the death of the local music scene. It was a monumental event and impact that changes how you look at stuff.
While the death of Kurt Cobain signaled the end of Nirvana, it didn't necessarily put an end to grunge's reign, though things certainly started to change within some of the other dominating bands at the time.
It's not a local club scene anymore. It's an international, global lens that is being focused on these people. And, there is no question that the double-edged sword of stardom starts putting pressure on a community, starts putting pressure on bands, starts putting pressure on individual musicians. I remember Eddie coming by the radio station when Time magazine chose to put his face on the cover of their magazine even after Kurt and Ed both declined. What price or what pressure that put on him to be the face of a generation or the face of a community of music. How pissed he was.
I think that they weren't necessarily prepared for it. I don't think anybody could be prepared for it at that young of an age. When you take an area of people that were already kind of in a downtrodden area, or they're coming from really modest means, if you will, and then all of a sudden the rest of the world hears it and it's this explosion because it's a brand new sound. And you take these young men and women that were just kind of living their lives, loving playing music, doing what they always do, but all of a sudden the world is now paying attention. And I shudder to think that necessarily Kurt Cobain realized he was going to be the voice of a generation, but he was.
It's a lot for a young person at any time in life, whether they're an entertainer or whether they're a sports figure. The sort of adulation that young people get at these apexes of their careers is not normal. And honestly, somebody needs to do a really serious study about it, because it can inflict a lot of grief, it can inflict a lot of confusion. There is a lot to be said about taking things slowly. Sometimes you don't have that option when the juggernaut is chugging along. People have to decide, I'm going to keep going with it, or I'm going to take a different direction.
Pearl Jam's Mike McCready went to rehab in 1994, where he met John Baker Saunders, who had played in the Walkabouts. Upon returning home to Seattle, the musicians joined Barrett Martin of Skinyard and Screaming Trees to form a band, but they needed a singer. Lane Staley had been in and out of rehab to treat his own heroin addiction many times during those few years that Alice in Chains were on top of the world. So McCready invited him to participate in the project, and he later revealed that he hoped their newfound sobriety would inspire each other to stay clean. This supergroup, which also featured guest vocals from Screaming Trees' Mark Lanigan, came to be known as Mad Season, and their sole album Above came out in March of 1995, just a few months prior to Alice in Chains' third self-titled record, which debuted at #1 on the charts. Alice in Chains released an entertaining mockumentary home video called The Nona Tapes as a means of promoting the album, but they chose not to do a full tour in support of it. They did, however, perform a legendary MTV Unplugged set in April of 1996.
Alice in Chains Unplugged, the last night that I saw Lane Staley alive, I walked up on stage with a couple of the other MTV people after the taping ended. And I walked up to Lane, I just said, "Hey Lane, man, it was really great tonight." And he said, "Well, thanks, Matt. He goes, I gotta get out of here." And it was because his girlfriend, of course, had been rushed to the hospital. He had found that out, so Sony put him on the Sony jet and flew him back to Seattle.
They played a handful of shows later that year with Kiss, too. But Staley's addiction was starting to get the best of him, and a few months later, his former fiancée Demry Parrott, who's depicted with Staley on the cover of the Mad Season album, died as a result of her own struggle with drugs. Various reports note that Staley was put on 24-hour suicide watch after her death, and he became a recluse.
When Alice dropped from public eye, it's no secret. It was a brutal battle with addiction, and during that time was also had come after the success of their studio albums and world tours, and it's a lot. So at that point for Alice, the success and the excess had become damaging, where they wanted to sort of reel it in, and Lane started doing another project with Mike McCready and Barrett Martin and Baker Saunders called Mad Season. Jerry worked on a solo record. Alice in Chains hadn't broken up. During that time, they needed to get another perspective. And the demons of addiction, they don't rest. And we've had far too many lose that battle from our community. But it's not a unique story. It's not a unique story to rock and roll in general. It's been happening since the 60s.
That was never not a part of the scene up there. I'm sure it's a part of every rock and roll scene anywhere to some degree. Washington State is a depressing place. Cloudy and rainy, and it's really nice maybe 3 months a year. And there's heavy alcoholism and heroin addiction, but there's heroin addiction and alcoholism everywhere. I don't know that scene, it may just be a coincidence if it's that scene, but it's definitely more depressing there. That was the most depressing time of my life, was living there. I'm a much happier, much more productive, much better person in every way once I got out of there. I don't know why.
Bands didn't have problems. Individuals within those bands had problems. There's an aspect of drug culture that was very much not shared socially in the music culture. So those individuals that you may know of to have had drug problems perhaps had their addiction issues within the context of being in a band, but it was not indicative of that band. I can safely say that that was not an issue for Soundgarden. We drank like any other jerks would drink, and even that was, there's a lightweightedness to some of the people who were there. Because the drug culture, there's something about it that's insular. There's involves a private shared thing with those people, and there's probably a component of it that involves shame. So they're not telling you, "Hey man, I just went and shot up" or whatever. They're not. That's their thing. It's a private, personal thing. So I think the rest of us were not always aware of these little pockets of behaviors that individuals were engaging in. I'd want to absolve the scene and community of responsibility for the choices made, the very personal choices that some individuals made.
I didn't necessarily go into rehab, and I didn't necessarily do a STEPS program or what have you. But if you know anything about me and my history, I'm a drug addict and I'm an alcoholic, and I will be forever, because there's a guy in here that his sole mission is to kill me. So I understand that element and how distorted substances can make you. What it was with that era too, I think, is it was hard drugs. It was heroin, spike and vein. It was speedball, cocaine addiction, massive addictions to opioids. And so when you're talking about these hard drugs, that, where it ain't fun anymore, it was binging these substances and having a warped sensibility with these young minds, thinking that they needed that. And a lot of times they were doing it to cope because, once again, the quick rise. And I'm glad we have all the music. I'm glad we have all the songs. But I hate the fact that we had to lose these people, certain very influential people, to substances because people didn't know how to talk to them. And it could have possibly been prevented.
From what I know, addiction, and it comes in many forms: alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling. It's just pick your drug. The disease is the disease. It's centered in the mind. I can speak on alcoholism and drug addiction, but the main thing is in an addict brain. And listen, I'm not a professional. I'm just going to give you what I know. With alcohol, it's like a physical craving for alcohol coupled with a disease that's centered in the mind. And for far too long, I feel like society and the media and school has portrayed addicts and alcoholics as bad people. There are highly functioning people with the disease of addiction. This disease does not discriminate. There's all colors of the rainbow. And just from my experience, I would get so nervous on stage, so I would drink, because look at what we do. It's pretty intense. Getting up in front of thousands and thousands of people and then exposing yourself to criticism. It can be pretty scary, but...
Around this time, Soundgarden released their final album before going on a hiatus as well. Down on the Upside came out in May of '96, but the band didn't last much longer after that.
We had a couple really tough tours. No one was happy. There's a lot of drinking and just sloppy shows. So it seemed like we really needed to just kind of regroup once we got back from that 96, 97 tour. But I just kind of went into work mode when we got off the road. I started writing demos, and I was just like, yeah, let's do our next record. Yeah. And then Chris came over one day and quit the band. so that's how it ended.
By this point, Pearl Jam had released the albums Vitalogy and No Code and engaged in a boycott against Ticketmaster because they didn't want their fans to have to pay high fees in order to see them play live. Since Ticketmaster controlled many major venues, they weren't able to perform in the US for several years. Following the disbandment of Soundgarden, Matt Cameron went on to join Pearl Jam.
I was working on a record with my buddy John McBain. I called up Stone at the time, who had a record label called Loose Grooves, and I called to inquire about putting out my band with John. And then Eddie got on the phone and said, "Hey, what are you doing this summer?" I would love to go on tour with Pearl Jam. I mean, who wouldn't, But it was a sort of a fill-in. It was a fill-in for Jack Irons kind of situation when I first joined. They had this tour booked, and Jack quit sort of, I don't know, maybe a month or two before the tour was going to start. So we were we made a mad dash to the rehearsal space and just kind of went through all the songs as much as possible. It took me a while to kind of get all the music learned properly, and but it was a really fun challenge.
While the big guns in grunge were either taking breaks or just simply slowing down, other genres started to come to the forefront of the music industry, including post-grunge and, even more so, nu metal. Grunge wasn't dead, but it wasn't the hot new topic anymore.
There is almost always historically, there is finite times in any sort of cultural movement. That's the nature of art. It keeps evolving. So the bands in Seattle in this particular movement that was under the umbrella of grunge, they got a really great run out of it. So tragedies aside, there was destined to be an obsolescence of a very tight-knit scene. It just doesn't, we don't all stay in college forever, kind of a comparison. That said, the deaths of our friends were sobering, sombering, painful experiences that absolutely gave people pause.
I think because it had gotten so big and because the mainstream had embraced it, I feel like that could have had something to do with it, where it just the people just moved on, and that's just kind of what happens with art, with music. Once something becomes that big, that much of a force, then styles change and trends change and tastes change. And
yeah, I think there was some burnout in the mid to late 90s on grunge. You know, anything that gets overhyped or oversaturated, there's going to be a backlash against it, you know, until it's not there anymore, and then everyone, you know, embraces it again. And I think that sort of needed to happen with grunge, particularly, you know, and the fact that Nirvana wasn't around anymore didn't help. It just had become another sort of settled rock scene.
And the waning of the music scene, I don't know, you could probably find a scientific algorithm to the concept of absolute saturation. You couldn't get away from Seattle. I'd say 95 on would be when the pressure started to back off. Everything seemed to be coming out of Seattle. So at a certain point, you know, the media monoliths are probably wondering, you know, what else is there out there? Or God, not another Seattle band. Which I felt bad for a lot of the Seattle artists that, you know, had releases in the mid 90s and on, because just from burnout, global burnout, it can tend to affect the success or failure of a record.
With Alice in Chains on hiatus, Jerry Cantrell released his first solo record in March of 1998. The last songs Alice recorded together with Lane were around 1998 and 1999 and were titled Get Born Again and Died. Alice in Chains fans all know how this story ends, and while there are various reports of sightings of Staley in the late 90s from different people, we don't have a right to speculate about his physical state while he was choosing to stay out of the public eye. All we know for sure are the facts. The singer was found dead in his condo in April of 2002, and the tragedy was ruled an accidental overdose.
And you know, I think many of us, sadly, didn't think that Lane would live that long after his girlfriend passed away. But he lived a lot longer than I think a lot of us expected him to. Of course, the hope, you know, we prayed that Lane would get well and get better, and that he would, you know, find a way to come out of it, like Mark Lanegan did. But Lane, was never able to pull himself out of it, and it was sad.
I remember when Lane passed, getting the news. I remember being at his memorial. I didn't cry when Andrew passed. I didn't cry when Kurt passed. But when I attended Lane's memorial, the tears came for all of them.
The music and the lyrics of Alice in Chains could understandably have created a misrepresentation of Lane. Lane absolutely carried a lot of pain. He also was one of the sweetest, really. He was a sweet person. He had an incredible sense of mischief. So in his sweetness, he also loved to do many mischievous things. And I'm not talking about suffering from addiction being a mischievous thing. I'm talking about putting fart cushions underneath couch cushions. You know, that sort of merrymaking and mirth was his. He literally had a physical twinkle in his eye, and he didn't have any sense of ego that can often come along with someone that has the responsibility of having the microphone, being a singer, being a focal point. It can make people in that position have walls up. And Lane didn't have walls up. Talk about a fashion master with following no one else's drum. My God, we didn't know what color hair, how long, clothes. He was so incredibly creative in terms of his persona, his physical persona. He was an amazing Amazing young man.
As we'll discuss in the next and final episode of this series, Lane Staley wasn't the last member of the Seattle scene that we lost prematurely. But rather than harping on the casualties, we're also going to discuss the impact that grunge in Seattle had on rock and roll for generations to come.
I think the thing that was so great about what grunge did for rock and roll at the time is it really returned the ability for artists to be very DIY.
It's because they weren't hiding any part of themselves. They were just being themselves, just that's all they knew how to do.
All those bands and what they did for that period there in the early to mid 90s was so profound, had such an effect.
None of us could have ever imagined that we would be writing a new chapter in rock history.
I don't know that you can find a regional music scene of such breadth and depth and musical variety.
Every musical revolution that's happened throughout history has changed pop culture and society in some way. And that's what the entire point of this series has been about. We didn't exactly end the last episode on a happy note, and unfortunately, when it comes to the timeline of what happened after Lane Staley died, we're not out of the darkness just yet. But there's a lot to discuss about where many of the Seattle musicians' careers went once the grunge explosion died down and other subgenres took the front seat in the music industry.
Being on the sidelines and not being a musician, being a radio person, being a music lover, and being blessed with the ability to be part of this community that we talk about 30 years later. There is a true pride that we carry to watch bands and musicians be able to move forward and explore new things. If their band breaks up, to watch them group together with some other musicians and make something new or have another opportunity.
After Kurt Cobain's death in 1994, Dave Grohl went on to form Foo Fighters. Chris Cornell joined forces with the members of a disbanded Rage Against the Machine to form Audioslave. Alice in Chains didn't plan on carrying on without Lane, but eventually befriended William Duvall and started making music with him behind the mic. Eddie Vedder had a few solo ventures, but remained with Pearl Jam, and they've released 7 studio albums since 1996's No Code, which was the last of their records that we discussed. And a lot of these bands are still selling out arenas and stadiums today. That isn't to say that it's been a happily ever after type of story for all of them, though. Former Alice in Chains bassist Mike Starr tragically died of an overdose in 2011. Stone Temple Pilots broke up sometime around 2003, and Scott Weiland, who was in and out of rehab, went on to join Guns N' Roses Slash, Duff McKagan, and Matt Sorum in Velvet Revolver for 2 albums before returning to Stone Temple Pilots again. In December of 2015, the singer was found lifeless on his tour bus while he was on the road with his band The Wildabouts, and it was a shock to many.
The last weekend I saw Scott Weiland live. I interviewed him at this radio convention in Carlsbad, California. He was very late for it that day, which wasn't unusual for Scott, as you know, with his struggles. And even when Scott was not in good shape, and he was like, I'd say he was firing on about 30% of his potential, he still had more swagger than 90% of the rock guys that get on a stage. I mean, he still had the natural born swagger, but it was also very heartbreaking. Now, I saw him the next day, and he looked a little disheveled that day, and I just remember, I just kind of thinking to myself, man, why are people around him letting him, just kind of go out like this? And he said goodbye to me that day, and I never saw Scott again. Another devastating loss, like to rock and roll, to the music scene, when we lost Scott.
After a couple of albums with Audioslave, Chris Cornell worked on a few more solo records, and then Soundgarden announced their reunion sometime around 2010. They released King Animal 2 years later and went on a tour in support of it. A few years later, Cornell worked on another solo record and toured extensively on his own, did a brief run with Temple of the Dog in honor of its 25th anniversary, played a one-off show with Audioslave in 2017, and then Soundgarden started working on their 7th album. And then tragedy struck again. Cornell died by suicide in May of 2017 in the midst of a Soundgarden tour.
I don't know what happened with Chris Cornell. I don't know. It's a mystery. It's a very sad tragedy. I'm sure there's mental illness there. I know that kind of stuff was sort of hinted around about Chris, but he was kind of a morose guy to some degree. But I always felt that he let that come out in his music, and maybe that was a better stopgap for what might be going on within his head. But you never know with that kind of stuff.
Chris Cornell is probably the biggest shock and surprise of any of them. I mean, yeah, while it was happening, okay, drug overdoses, etc. It just tragic and awful, but somewhat explainable in the way people were doing their lives at the time.
We were there that night. I talked to Chris Cornell, I gave him a hug. I watched him leave the venue, and then the night went on as normal, and to wake up the next morning to the immense, just the bus, the wait. I sleep late, so I was the last to find out, and I woke up and walked into the front lounge, and everyone's just head in hand, devastated, and everyone kind of looked up at me and went, "She doesn't know. Oh, it's gonna be bad." When you've related to their music and you've listened to those records, throughout your whole life ad nauseum, it feels like a part of you at that point. And so I feel like, losing someone like that, you feel like you're losing a piece of yourself in a way. And also, in the grander scheme, losing someone who's that talented and that prolific is just devastating, because it's well, that was it. That was it? No, that it can't be it. And so it's a big, it's a shock and it's a trauma.
I remember being at the Rock on the Range when it was announced that Chris had passed away. And so that was really heavy because we were all there as a musical community. You could feel it in the not just backstage, but in the audience as well. I mean, it was just such a heavy day. I remember getting up in the bus, and some of our crew guys were sitting there, and people were really, you could tell something bad had just happened. And at first I was like, stop messing with me. But yeah, it was true. So it was heavy. But it was really something to hear how, as the day progressed, and people were talking about it from the stage and sharing their stories and playing tributes. And man, I mean, it made you aware of the impact that he had on so many of us.
And I loved Chris very much, man. Besides being one of my favorite singers of all time, songwriters, he was a big, beautiful heart, man. Wrote about the things that went on with him, and just a lot of things that he went through. He's just a deep-rooted soul. And the day he died, I was walking down the street in San Francisco, man, and I cried. I literally lost control. I went off the deep end for a bit.
I would have never expected that. I knew Chris pretty well when he was younger. I knew he had a penchant for darkness and depression. But I would have never, other people who knew him better may have different insights. I had known for decades at that point that Chris had struggles with darkness. The last time I had seen him had been in the 90s. We were close for a narrow time during the 80s.
More telling because of the fact that nobody did know that he was struggling like that with these kinds of thoughts, that he would have done something like that. If you look at the footage at the Fox Theater in Detroit, he was smiling, he was happy. He was like, "We're gonna see you again soon, Detroit, love you." And then we all know what happened. It was such a shock, though, to the world. What do you mean Chris Cornell died by suicide?
I just remember being so sad because I guess he did have a history with addiction. I just know how lonely and isolated and difficult that journey can be. And the music he left behind, what a brilliant artist.
When looking back at all of the members of the Seattle music scene who've fallen since Andrew Wood's initial death in 1990, it may seem easy to write grunge off as a subgenre that was full of depression, addiction, and tragedy. Was it just coincidence that so many prominent musicians died prematurely, or was there an actual mental health pandemic happening within the region?
There was so much amazing music that came out of here, whether people heard it on the international stage or if it was within the community of our Seattle clubs. There was a lot of music. So there was a lot of musicians, and there was just sort of per capita, perhaps, there was more publicized loss because there was so many creative people. there's plenty that are still playing music or that have gone on to other careers from there. We also are looking at a much more sensational news cycle in the 90s and into the 2000s, where there was a need to sell stories, if you will. And this scene got dubbed that everyone was doing heroin, and that was far, far from the case. There were absolutely people that suffered heroin addiction here, as there was in every city around America. So just the fact that there was a spotlight on Seattle, I think that's why it got the reputation. That being said, the fact that people were self-medicating indicates that there was some other issue going on, that there was some sort of mental health issue that led people to self-medicate. But there's far more stories of people that didn't self-medicate that may have also had a hard time dealing with the spotlight, the success, and they dealt with it in a different way. So it's unfair to have this umbrella of doom and gloom and loss. It's just the propensity of the spotlight is what I think what points that out.
I think there's more understanding of mental health issues in general in all lines of work, and I think sometimes in the arts there's a conception that artists get to do exactly what they want, and so therefore how could they have any mental health issues? But sometimes the artist is they're sort of on that edge, on that fine line. And I don't know if it's specifically Seattle, but at the time, when our music scene was kind of taken off, there was a pretty big drug problem that was in the Northwest. There was a lot of heroin and things like that. Nothing I ever got involved with, but I did see some of my friends and contemporaries go down that path. Yeah, there is sort of this connection with drug use and mental illness attached to our music scene, which makes it even more real.
Yeah, it's interesting how many casualties there were in that respect. Maybe that tells you something about how deep some of the things we were just talking about with whatever was haunting some of those guys and whatever they were trying to work through and whatever they were trying to deal with. Some of those monsters were just too big to overcome, and that's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it does seem like the Seattle music scene has somewhat of a Faustian bargain going on. It keeps going on. That's the sad thing, I mean, as we get older, we're all going to die. Eventually, everyone from the Seattle scene is going to die, but it also, a lot of it seemed, quite premature and somewhat avoidable. I don't know.
Every time a musician from this region and from this scene has gone down, it's been a shock. There were some things that were less surprising, but you never really expect this to happen. And it wasn't like a contagion. I just think that there was availability to a lot of drugs. I think there were a lot of mental health issues. I think that it's more a tragic coincidence that these people went down who were all part of this city. It's a hard thing to process under any circumstances, but when you have the world looking over your shoulder, it's particularly perilous because there's no privacy. There's no place to grieve in a normal human way of grieving.
I come firmly from the belief that music is personal, and if you are a fan of, say, Nirvana or Soundgarden or Alice in Chains or Mother Love Bone, and the lead singer of your favorite band passes, that mourning and that grief is a personal experience. There's nothing that I can say that can encapsulate that. Some of the artists that tragically passed there were warning signs and some there weren't. I think it's important to acknowledge the individual that is separate from the musical entity of which they belonged. And each person had their journey. All of them left a hole. Kurt passing, Lane passing, Chris passing, Sean Smith passing, Ben McMillan of Grunt Truck passing, Mia Zapata being murdered. I think people forget how many artists and how big and how completely enveloping the Seattle music scene, or grunge as you call it, became in the late 80s and early 90s.
While it's impossible not to mention all of the losses, we don't want them to overshadow or tarnish the legacy of grunge. Whether these musicians are still alive today or not, the music they created and the scene that they were a part of was a monumental part of rock and roll history. When we look back on the other subgenres that came in the years after grunge's reign, there are a couple of things that are apparent in the way it influenced rock and roll. We've spoken a lot about the authenticity of the artists, their indisputable talent, and the way they push back against pop culture standards. But one of the most important aspects of the music the Seattle artists made was their transparency about real-life situations: mental illness, drug addiction, grief, and frustration with society. Many contemporary rock artists write songs about these same topics today. So did the grunge artists pave the way for these conversations to be had and for music to be so introspective?
You know, it's an interesting concept to think and appreciate the fact of how candid and authentic the integrity that music that came out of the Seattle area had, maybe through honesty and openness, helped provide a platform. Yeah, I would. It feels good to think and recognize that, yeah, the Seattle music scene and its candor in the lyrics helped start that stage and that platform for mental health conversations going forward.
You know, I think that those bands in that time era is one of the reasons why we have an awareness now of mental health and why it's so important. You listen back to those records, you listen to what's being said in those songs. You know, they gave the voiceless a voice. People are talking about it because you're programmed in life, at least how I grew up. It was like, if you're depressed or you're sad or you're upset with something, get over it. You know, that's life. Like, get over it. Some people, there's a chemical imbalance and they have to work really, really hard to balance it out. I mean, I've often told people, I started writing songs because it's cheaper than therapy. It's my outlet, and I know how people feel because I've been there. And it's why I identify with all those bands when I was growing up. Like the 90s for me, that was my high school. From like freshman year of high school to when I graduated in 1996, when I was a senior, I was in, like, that was like the mecca, for all those bands. And the thing that's interesting about all those bands, especially Nirvana, in a lot of ways, Kurt Cobain helped me look at who I really was inside and take responsibility for that, for good or for bad.
I think that the fact that they were open and honest about it just proves how real they are. Like, if you are hiding something because it's taboo or considered taboo or a difficult subject matter to confront or talk about, that's never healthy. So I applaud them for speaking about it, because I think that that was the first step to which is going to be a continual process. But I'm seeing it more and more being spoken about in press now, that mental health is something that a lot of people struggle with, and it's something that shouldn't be shunned and shouldn't be hidden. It's something that needs to be discussed so that people can actually seek help for it. I think that they were very brave, and it just kind of goes to show why those records connected to so many people. It's because they weren't hiding any part of themselves. They were just being themselves, just as all they knew how to do.
I think a lot of artists are hardwired that way, to where they deal with their demons. And I feel like a lot of those artists from that scene were transparent with that. And for those of us who had our own struggles, and they would convey what they were going through, and we respected them and looked up to them, and then it made you feel like you weren't the only one. There's something about knowing that somebody else is feeling the same way you do, and somebody who's been able to take that and create something really beautiful with it. You know, that's the thing, is that you listen to some of those songs and they take all of that pain and anxiety or whatever it is, and they mold it into something beautiful, and then it's released into the world and it becomes an elixir, you know, for the rest of us.
Absolutely. And now it's like as common as the grass. Like I just know so many musicians that are sober in recovery, and they don't subscribe to that stereotypical sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle that was so glamorized, because enough people started dying and realizing they had a problem. But I do think, yes, thank you to these artists that are brave and step forward and talk about their struggles, because it is so common and there's so many people that just need to hear it.
I think that mental health and honest songs about depression and true loneliness and despair are only more evident now, and bands aren't afraid to sing about those things and write about them because they opened the door for it. We've come a long way from that era, but they had to kick the door down. And you know, with the help of radio and MTV at the time, their message came across to more young people than any other time, where, you know, and it was pretty amazing.
There was something that I think happened in this community that was a little unique, and that was people sharing their vulnerability, sharing the fact that they had pain and they had fear, and that life wasn't perfect and the goals weren't, you know, always the excesses of rock and roll. It wasn't, they were more introspective, if you will. So maybe, just maybe, that the area got a reputation for having more mental health issues because they were simply being honest about it. There's been a lot of loss over the course of music history, and a lot of the music was, you know, was just focused elsewhere. It wasn't focused so introspectively, so internally. It was something the press wrote about a lot. It was something that the band members themselves were queried about a lot. Just the fact that they were willing to share their fear and their sorrow. So perhaps that's why it seems like this area in particular had a higher number of losses, of incidents.
One thing that I noticed, especially with, you know, like Eddie Vedder and Kurt Cobain, the way they sang was very confessional and disclosive emotionally in their tone, their singing style. I think that there was something very unique about that, this kind of honesty, and they were really open and willing to let people in, you know, to their, or at least it seemed that they're willing to let people into their hearts in the way they inflected their vocal melodies, the way they sang. I think those are components of the success of their bands.
If there's an easy way to describe what happened in Seattle between the mid-1980s and 1990s, it's that there was a collection of artists who started combining their punk and metal influences to create a new sound, a steady rise in popularity as a result of the talent and authenticity of these artists, an explosion due to a couple of really imperative releases, and then a plateau period in which the intensity of the spotlight began to taper, just as it does with any movement in popular culture. So that begs the question, was grunge a movement in rock and roll, just as the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s and the development of thrash in the Bay Area in the 80s had been before it?
I would say it was a movement in rock history. Yeah, absolutely. I just have to pinch myself, you know? I mean, it feels amazing. None of us could have ever imagined that we would be writing a new chapter in rock history. Like, the records that we made, they're going to continue to influence new generations. And I think for me, that's what I'm most proud of, is I see music as a continuum. You know, I love it when people tell me stuff like that, like, you know, I was going through this thing and I listened to your records and Chris's lyrics really spoke to me, or the music spoke to me, or something like that. So, I mean, that feels awesome. It's bittersweet, unfortunately, for me, you know, losing Chris and Soundgarden, but our music lives on, and that's what matters.
The Seattle music scene, in my opinion, was very unique because it was left to its own devices for a long enough period of time. It was a unique community, and you can even blame the weather and the rain for people being inside and spending more time together creating music. I don't know that you can find a regional music scene of such breadth and depth and musical variety. I don't see that it's happened since then. The fact that it was a style of rock that was enough to tilt the musical axis and completely pivot and change directions, you know, it doesn't surprise me, but I wouldn't say that it was a calculated movement by any means. It was the magical formula of timing, talent, and tenacity.
Yeah, I'd say it was a movement. All those bands and what they did for that period there in the early to mid 90s was so profound and had such an effect that you can still that still reverberates to this day. I mean, it still influences. You talk to so many young artists and they will bring up any number of those bands as bands that influence what they do, and it's to me that era is kind of timeless in a lot of ways. I mean, it may not have been as big as it was by the late 90s, but it's still something that was important. It was an important. I think that's what's beautiful about that whole scene, is it will always be important in the evolution of rock music. Listening to what they left behind, the legacy each of those guys left behind, and knowing how that will continue to play on, it's kind of like though they're gone in physical form, their spirit's still very much here, and that's beautiful.
I think grunge was definitely a movement. Anything that makes waves is a movement. And I think it stemmed from these artists just being true to who they were and having such a strong passion and desire for what they were doing. Like, when something is really good, it's good. You can't stop it. You just can't stop it. So I really appreciate that moment in time in music.
That was an incredible time because it had such an incredible reach. Those records, just like they became a part of the culture and they reached everyone. I mean, because it went not just from the alternative rock stations, but so many. Then all of a sudden, all those bands started crossing over into top 40, those radio stations. I think the thing that was so great about what grunge did for rock and roll at the time is it really returned the ability for artists to be very DIY. Like, they didn't have to be fit into one sound. And the grunge thing even inspired bands like Oasis, who came in, you know, a couple of years later. Because, you know, Noel Gallagher told me that it was Nirvana was as responsible for Oasis as anything. He said that if it wasn't for Nirvana and that scene, he would have never realized to get the idea to write songs that were pop with melody, but use all that distortion and noise in the guitars. So that's just an example of how far-reaching the effect of Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Screaming Trees were. Everything that was happening there, it just inspired so many people. So that was one of the most exciting times in rock history. I don't think there's been a groundswell since.
I think it was a movement in that it had an identity and a shared culture with the musicians in our community, in the Seattle area, as well as those we shared those sort of aesthetic and cultural values with from other communities, other bands, and other record labels. So that identity, we definitely had a friendship and sound that would distinguish us both culturally and aesthetically from other movements.
It was a movement, I think, just because geographically it came out of one place for the most part. Not to say that there weren't bands that sounded like Seattle grunge bands playing elsewhere, but the fact that so many came out of this, one small to medium sized scene was pretty different, influential. I mean, New York and LA had their own kind of music scenes going on, but it was hard to classify, whereas it was very easy to just say, oh yeah, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, grunge.
I think the impact of having so many great bands from the same general region playing for each other for years in relative obscurity, and then suddenly having a breakthrough by having one of the beloved bands of this general scene have the Smells Like Teen Spirit phenomenon happen to them. It was going to change everything, and it did. And that's kind of what galvanized everything into the grunge Seattle thing once and for all. It became an inescapable global phenomenon. But there was never any consciousness. Bruce and I, fumbling around, trying to figure out what we're doing. I mean, there's some stuff that we definitely did know what we were doing, but like the rest of the scene, we were along for the ride. For me, it's been a lot of fun. I've been able to make a career out of something that I enjoy. A lot of stories to tell, a lot of great music. I wouldn't suggest it for everybody to go out and create a global music phenomenon. If it lands on your lap, don't throw it away.
For the most part, the thing that I respect most about the musicians in Seattle that I've had the pleasure of working with is how their feet are still firmly on the ground. I didn't feel a lot of pretentiousness. They just wanted to be real, and they were fans of music and wanted to play. And when your passion is to play and make music, it's quite a sight to see.
Well, there you have it. And that concludes our 30 Years of Grunge series. Thank you to all of the incredible individuals that gave us their time to participate in this project and tell us their stories, to all of the musicians who created this timeless era in music, and to all of you for being fans and for watching.